right, so let's start. As I've said, I'm not an expert. I'm a layperson giving a presentation. This is an open presentation. We can all ask questions and discuss more deeply. If something is interesting to you or you want to spend more time on it, we can definitely do that. This is the second part in hopefully a two-part series, maybe longer. The Zionist movement and the creation of the State of Israel. Now, we've talked before about the territories and how this area was divided historically. We've talked about how before Zionism became a mainstream movement among Jews, creating a secular national homeland for the Jewish people in the historic land of Israel, you had religious Zionists on the Jewish side, like the rabbis Tzvi Kalisher and Yehuda Alkalai, who had sort of a religious view that allowed for an allowed for a Jewish state to exist, but only under Jewish messianic terms. You had false messiahs like Shabbatai Tzvi, who had come in the Jewish world and created sort of a millenarian aspect. And because of that, Jews felt like the end times were coming and felt that they were allowed to go back to Israel. And of course, you had Christian rulers who had their own idea about the Jews returning being important for their understanding of Christianity, and the Jews just being a cog in that wheel. But the idea that there should be a secular Jewish state was really a development that came out of the Maskilim, right? This Jewish enlightenment that we talked about. And there were many aspects of this Haskalah, this Jewish enlightenment, but by and large, it had several main themes. The first main theme was that it embraced science, literature, technology, development in much the same way that they had been embraced by secular non-Jewish Europeans, and created a Jewish sort of space to be religiously Jewish somehow, as well as being integrated into the European modernization experiment. It also another theme that it dealt with was what was called Judenfrage, or the question of Jewish integration into Europe. Could a Jew be a European? Is this, or is there something about Jewishness or Jewish physicality or Jewish mental space that makes them incompatible with the European context? And other developments included the development of a modern Hebrew language, which is, you can see with Eliezer ben Yehuda and his wife Hemda, who finished most of his manuscripts after he died. We then saw that during the Ottoman period, you had what was called the first Aliyah. So you had Leon Pinsker, right? He was a dentist from Odessa in Ukraine today. It was the Russian Empire at that point. And he decided to lead what were called the Chovavei Zion, the Lovers of Zion, to create a settler outpost in the Ottoman territory. Now, what happens when you send a bunch of Europeans who had lived mostly in the city to become farmers is that it didn't go very well. And you have these few first settlements that exist, and half of the population goes back to Europe. The remainder stays, but only because they receive funding from Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who was a French member of the Rothschild banking family. At the same time, we see a wave of immigration from the Yemenites, from Yemen. Now, these Yemenites are coming because they're having a millenarian moment as well, and they believe that the time of the Messiah is near, so they're making the immigration to Israel. And because they end up arriving and they have a much better understanding of the terrain, they end up being a huge force in developing the first Aliyah and making it somewhat viable in the long term. We then really saw the development of Zionism as a secular doctrine, right? We had Theodor Herzl, and he wrote his book Alt Neuland, Old New Country, in response to seeing the Dreyfus affair, where Dreyfus, you can see on the left-hand side, was kicked out of the French army after a kangaroo court found him guilty of treason against the French Republic. Now, the evidence that they used was completely fabricated, and it's clear that there was a different person who was actually guilty, but that he was Christian. And so they accused Dreyfus using his Jewish faith as an indication of his disloyalty. Now, Herzl had come to expect that the Russian Empire would treat Jews with disdain and negativity, but the idea that it would happen in a civilized country such as France was something that he couldn't imagine happening until he saw this event, and that led him to believe that the only way that the Jews could be self-sufficient and able to survive in the long term was if they had a state of their own. And so he wrote a second pamphlet called Judenstaat, meaning Jewish state, and he considered it Lösung der Judenfrage, a solution to the Jewish question, right? We talked about Judenfrage being the Jewish question, could Jews integrate in Europe? And he's saying this is the solution, right? Lösung der Judenfrage, a solution to the Jewish question. As I pointed out last time, there's only one syllable different from the Nazis' declaration, Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question, which was how they described the Holocaust, right? That was so there was this view that there was a Jewish question and there were different solutions to the Jewish question. Herzl's solution was to get the Jews out of Europe, and Herzl's solution was to get the Jews out of Europe, and the Nazi solution obviously was to get rid of Jews, period. But it's interesting, at least to me, that both of these are taking place in the German language, which Herzl believed to be the educated language that Jews should be speaking. Herzl actually petitioned. Yeah.
When did that term, the Jewish question, come into existence?
Judenfrage was a term at least from the 17th century. A lot of philosophers were using it, and it was a shorthand for, as I said, this question of Jews are a distinct religion, people, race, ethnicity. The language for this that we have today is much more clear and much more precise than they had back then. But they understood that there was something different about the Jewish experience in Europe than the Christian experience in Europe. And the question was whether or not those were reconcilable, whether a Jew could be both a Jew and a European at the same time. Herzl's view, after he saw the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, was that that was not possible, that Jews could not also be Europeans, because there was something deep in the soul of the Europeans that rejected Jews as people. And so they needed to find a way to be independent and self-determining of their own destiny. Now, of course, that his belief wasn't the only one. And of course, it clashes very strongly with the integrationists, you can see in the lower left-hand side, which held the opposite answer to Judenfrage, right? Their view was that Jews could actually be a part of Europe, and that and just like most Jews in America today would consider themselves integrationists along with being Zionists. Right? They believe that they can be Jews in America, and their Americanness and their Jewishness are not in any way incompatible, that the values between those two are shared. Of course, integrationists at this time in the 19th century had to do a little bit more to integrate. We talked a little bit about Heinrich Heine. Heinrich Heine was Jewish, and he stayed Jewish until he turned 27 or 28 when he converted to Lutheranism. He believed that he needed to convert in order to promote his professional career. He was a poet and a writer, one of the most celebrated writers of the Romantic period in the 19th century. And to his right, you see Gabriel Riese. Gabriel Riese, as I said, served in the Hamburg government, but he only was able to do so after he tried numerous times to get citizenship of the city of Hamburg, because at this time Germany was a number of different city-states, right? It hadn't been completely unified. But there were times when Jews could become citizens and times when Jews couldn't become citizens. That integration was not simply being a different religion while in Europe. There was more of a process to it. And the integrationists simply said that it was a matter of time before Jews would achieve equality, and so the need for an independent Jewish state was not there. You also, of course, have the Orthodox opposition to Zionism. The Orthodox were by far the largest and most unified in their opposition to Zionism. And you can see two Orthodox rabbis who were strongly anti-Zionist, Chaim Spira and Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. And both of them held that unless the Messiah was coming, unless the end of times was coming, the Jews were forbidden from going back to the land of Israel, and because of the agreement in the Talmud, which says that until the end of days, the Jews are not permitted to return, and in return, the people outside of Israel, the other nations, promised to treat the Jews not too harshly. So as long as this agreement held, God was forbidding the Jewish people from returning to Israel, and that was the general Orthodox position. You had the autonomists, which we discussed. They sort of go away, but their basic argument is, yes, the Zionists are right, Jews are a distinct people. Yes, they have their own cultural identity, but we should do that here. And the autonomists were operating primarily in Russia, which had numerous different ethnic categories, and those ethnic categories were all petitioning for their own cultural rights. You had Lithuanians and Belarusians and Ukrainians and Estonians, and all these groups were petitioning for their own linguistic and cultural protection. Simon Dovnov basically said the Jews should do that too. The Jews should consider themselves an ethnic nation like these other nations and have specific cultural, educational, and institutional rights. And of course, the fourth category were the Bundists, who rejected the nationalist aspiration of Zionism because they were socialist or communist in inclination. They believed that all workers should unite together, and they just happened to be the Jewish representatives of that wider socialist union.
But can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
About the Jewish question.
Yeah.
There were other groups in Europe that were non-Christian also. I mean, I'm sure there were Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists.
There were Muslims in the southeast, but it was a very marginal population. If we're talking about France, Spain, Portugal, the Italian Peninsula, the German Confederation, Britain, Ireland, Poland, most of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, most of the Russian Empire, Scandinavia, we're talking about less than 1% not Jew, not Christian.
Okay.
These other populations were not there. The other distinction is that, for example, if we talk about something like Bosnia, right? Bosnia doesn't come under the purview of a Christian government until the late 1800s. And by that point, you have sort of an understanding that Bosnian Muslims won't be touched. But in other parts of Europe, such as Serbia or Greece, where there were Muslim communities, many of those communities were expunged towards the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries and forced into Turkey, where they were called muhajir, or immigrants. So, I mean, I guess there are some people who sort of quote joke that in Europe today there's Muslimfrage, right? Can Muslims be proper Europeans and this whole thing? But that's only because Muslims have become such a large European population in the 20th century. That didn't happen before. All right, so we talked about then how Herzl and Chaim Weizmann and several other Zionists convened the World Zionist Organization and brought together World Zionist Congresses. These congresses were responsible for determining the future of the Zionist enterprise. They also lead to the second Aliyah, which is the first one to establish what are called kibbutzim. The kibbutz is an Israeli socialist collective where numerous families work together and share all of their property and belongings. You can see in the lower left-hand side the picture of kibbutz the Ganya Aleph in 1910 when it was built. These groups had a little bit better time working as farmers, but still they had a lot to learn and were deeply unproductive. However, because they came there with a socialist ideology that Jews would be improved through the promotion of labor and taking on the agricultural tasks of their own, unlike the first Aliyah, they did not trust the agricultural development to the local Arab population and hire them. They actually tried to do it themselves, which led to an increasing segregation between the Yishuv, meaning the Jewish settlement population, and the indigenous Arab population. Now, the World Zionist, yeah.
I'm sorry. Were the kibbutzim set up by the Bundists who were socialists?
They were socialist in inclination, but they were not Bundists, right? Because the Bundists are operating in Europe. The Bundists believe that socialism in Europe is the solution for the Jewish people, right? Because with socialism, there will be no distinction between anybody of any religion. You will have the abolition of religion, so it's not important. But the Jews who were involved in the second Aliyah and in a number of further immigrations to Israel were left-leaning or socialist in orientation. The majority of them, when we say. And we talked a little bit about how Hollywood
Rich,
actually...
in question, in that early period, what were the Jews speaking?
Yiddish.
What? Yiddish.
Yiddish. Hebrew slowly became more and more influential in the 1920s. But the World Zionist Organization, most of the proceedings were performed in Yiddish or German. Yeah, because the distinction would be those Jews who believed Yiddish was too uncivilized, right? German was a written language. Yiddish was also a written language, but it was written in Hebrew characters. It was clearly dialectic. There were various versions. And so there was this idea that proper Jews, right? Like if you were to wear a suit and tie, you should speak German. There was a slow transition over the 1920s as you have the cultural Zionists, we'll talk a little bit about that, who saw a shift towards the use of Hebrew as a cultural language for Jews. We talked about how in the United States there was a general antipathy towards the Zionist movement up until the 1940s. So the early Hollywood movies were actually almost never about Jewish religious themes, Jewish cultural themes, or Zionism. Hollywood, by and large, excluded any of these narratives, and even though Jews were heavily involved with the nascent construction of Hollywood, in fact, Jews were a larger percentage of Hollywood in the 1920s than they are currently. They did not stress any Jewish themes and actually kept exclusively to a pro-American or pro-Christian narrative. The real leader who changed the face of American Zionism was soon-to-be Chief Justice Louis J. Brandeis. Brandeis was responsible for galvanizing the American Zionist movement and bringing 200,000 American Zionists to the cause. Even Jacob Schiff, who was the founder of the American Jewish Committee, which is currently the largest lobbying group that lobbies on behalf of the State of Israel after the America-Israel Political Action Committee, he was opposed to the creation of a State of Israel and believed that American Jews should seek safety and their own betterment in the United States. That said, he did help Jews who were in need or suffering in other parts of the world, especially Russia. We mentioned, for example, cultural Zionism, and you have here 3 different people who were cultural Zionists. Of them, Asher Tzvi Hirsch Ginsburg, known by his Hebrew moniker Achad Ha'am, wrote numerous poems about the State of Israel in Hebrew, and basically came up with the idea that Jews could only truly be themselves if they expressed themselves in the Hebrew language, and they expressed themselves on the territory of the historic Hebrew Jewish homeland, Eretz Israel. And so his idea was that Hebrew should become the language of the Jewish people, primarily because it was a unifier across Jews in time and space, and it was also something that is deeply indigenous to the land of Israel. And so it would connect the Jewish people to their homeland. You also have people who are cultural Zionists coming from the Middle East. For example, you have Albert Abraham Entebbe. We mentioned that he actually grew up in Damascus and moved to the Ottoman Empire. When he did that, he became part of the Ottoman state and considered that Jews should have an important role to play in the Middle East. He also was very much in favor of cultural institutions, Jewish cultural institutions making their place in the Middle East. He, for example, helped Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a French Jewish organization, build schools throughout Palestine, Ottoman Palestine at the time, and other parts of the Middle East. He was fluent in 5 languages and 4 different legal disciplines. He was a lawyer, but he was against the idea that Palestine should ever become independent of the Ottoman Empire, believing that in the Ottoman Empire, a cultural Jewish renaissance would be the salvation of the Jewish people. You also have Nassim Yaakov Malur. He grew up in Tzfat, which is in northern Israel, during the Ottoman period. He was fluent in both Hebrew and Arabic, and he spent time writing in Jewish newspapers in Hebrew about the need of Jews to learn Arabic, that Arabic was the future of the Jewish world, and that Jews would need to be able to communicate with the Arabs that they would be sharing their future home with. At the same time, he wrote in Arabic journals in Arabic, saying that Zionism would allow for the development and growth of Arab society, and so Arabs should be less resistant towards large-scale Jewish immigration from Europe to create a cosmopolitan Jewish entity that would be culturally Jewish, but beneficial to the Arabs who were living there.
Richard, did the Jews fare well under Ottoman Palestine? Were they tolerant?
They were tolerated as second-class citizens. There were periodic violent waves. The most famous one was in 1833 and 1834, when there was a war between the Khedivite state in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, and in the resulting chaos, there were attacks on the Jewish community. But by and large, as long as Jews accepted a second-class status, paid additional taxes, they did relatively well. those taxes were at least formally abolished and equality formally instated in 1836 with the Edict of Gülhane and the Hatay Humayun of, I believe it's 1851. But unfortunately, as important as those legal texts are, they didn't change as much on the ground as perhaps they could have. Then we talked about World War I, which was where everything changed. And the reason it changed is because the British take control of the territory, right? So in the upper right-hand corner, we have a young, strapping David Ben-Gurion when he was fighting in the British forces. We also have in the upper left-hand, we have Jabotinsky that we've talked about, and Joseph Trumpeldor. These were two Russian Jews who were relatively militant. Trumpeldor had a long history of war fighting experience that preceded this. He fought in the Russo-Japanese War for the Russian army. Jabotinsky, so the two of them served. Trumpeldor was known for his service in Gallipoli. He fought with distinction. And you can see also Lord Balfour, it's the only colored photograph on this page. Lord Balfour was British Home Secretary. And he issued the statement, the Balfour Declaration, that said that His Majesty looked with favor towards the creation of a Jewish national home in the territory of Palestine. There's debate as to the exact reason why he issued this declaration. Primarily, it's believed he wanted to secure Jewish financial resources to help the British fight World War I. But regardless, it meant that the British government was looking forward to creating a Jewish national home. You can also see, yeah.
Well, the Ottomans had declared for the Germans, so this was part of the one piece of the British strategy to destabilize and knock the Ottomans out of the war, actually, along with T.E. Lawrence's efforts and the Gallipoli campaign. It was all part of an effort just to get rid of the Ottomans, which succeeded eventually. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. T.E. Lawrence's coordination with the Sharif of Mecca.
In fact, the British worked very hard. The British diplomats before the war, they worked very hard to try to keep the Ottomans neutral, but the Ottomans made a foolish decision because they joined with the losers. So.
Yeah. You can see, that's exactly right. You can see on the lower left-hand side, General Allenby was a British general. He was actually a very fiercely religious Protestant, and he remembered several battles from the Bible, and so he actually cornered the Ottomans in the exact same positions that had been used according to the Bible, especially in the Battle of Michmash. But he was able to come into Jerusalem unscathed and take the city. And you can see on the right-hand side the Zion Mule Corps, which was a group of Zionists that had been organized by the British soldiers. The Zion Mule Corps is there sitting at the Western Wall, which is the holiest site in Judaism, after the British had liberated it from Ottoman control. You can also see that Zionists were doing outreach to the Arabs, and it was going relatively favorably at this point. In the circular bubble, you can see Weizmann on the left. He's dressed in a kifaya, and on the right, you can see Faisal I of the Hashemites. Faisal I first was appointed as king of Syria, and when he objected to French increasing rule of the territory, he became king of Iraq. But Faisal at this point saw the Zionist movement as being a positive move for the Middle East, and that the increasing Jewish presence in mandatory Palestine would lead to an economic revival, and that Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism could exist side by side to create a flowering Middle East.
Richard?
Yeah.
I think it's King Mohammed of Jordan. Is he a descendant of Faisal?
You think of King Abdullah II, the current reigning king of Jordan? Yes, King Abdullah II is not a descendant of King Faisal. They're cousins, though.
Okay.
They're both from the Hashemite family, and the reason the Hashemite family was empowered by the British is that they had a claim to legitimacy, being descendants of Muhammad, at least nominally.
Yeah, is that claim well established, or is it just?
I mean, like nobody doubts it. I don't know if you can trace the bloodline because written documents and that sort of thing. But yeah, so you had a number of battles as the British were trying to consolidate their position in the Levant region, right? Because the war ends in 1917, and the San Remo Conference, you can see in the bubble on the left-hand side is the San Remo Conference, which took place in April of 1920. In that time, there was a military occupation, and it was unclear which territories would go to the British and which territories would go to the French, who was a foreign occupant and who wasn't. And so there was a fight at Tel Hai, which is in that red circle, just north of Kfar Giladi. You can see, if we look at the mandatory borders of Palestine and Lebanon, as they would later be declared, you can see how it's really in an unclear zone as to whether it would go to Lebanon or to Palestine. Lebanon, of course, being under French occupation, Palestine under British occupation. And so the Jewish residents, the Yishuv residents of Tel Hai were attacked by Arabs coming from Lebanon. And 8 Jews died, including Trumpeldor. And his martyrdom, which is represented by that lion, which is erected now in Tel Hai, which of course is part of Israel today, really inspired the Zionist movement and galvanized at least a need in the minds of most of the Yishuv that there would be military strikes with the Arabs, and so a need for a militia was very important. After the Battle of Tel Hai, which took place on March the 1st, 1920, you had the Nebi Musa riots on April the 4th through April the 7th. You can see those epitomized by the Arabs carrying flags on horseback. The Nebi Musa riots resulted in 9 deaths, 4 Arabs, 5 Jews, as the Arabs were rioting against the possibility, of which later came to pass, of British control over the southern Levant. The Nebi Musa riots combined with the Battle of Tel Hai really made it clear to the Jews that nobody would protect them other than themselves. So we talked about the division of Palestine, and probably the most important person on this slide is the Grand Mufti, Hajj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini. He was appointed by First Viscount Herbert Samuel of the British Empire. He was appointed to run Palestine, and he did so from 1920 until 1922. He was a very pro-Zionist Jew, who of course was a British lord, and he generally had the ear of the Zionists more so than the Arabs. Later, later British governors would be either more even-handed or more pro-Arab. Under his watch, the mandate for Palestine was divided between Transjordan and Palestine west of the Jordan River. Transjordan was made separate territory in 1922, as I said, and King Abdullah I, the grandfather of the current Abdullah II, was appointed as king of Jordan.
Quick question, Richard. Transjordan, mostly desert?
Mostly desert. The mountainous area along the Jordan River is where the primary population center of Transjordan is. At this time, the population of what's labeled on this map as Jewish Palestine was 4 times the population in Transjordan. That should give you an idea about how vastly empty the territory really was.
So the map is very misleading.
Yeah. No, yeah.
I don't mean that it's incorrect, but I'm saying the sense that, you know, the idea that the population is concentrated in a very narrow band is something that you don't really walk away from the map with unless you understand that.
Oh, absolutely.
I read somewhere that Churchill was responsible for that strange shape. It's commonly called Churchill's fingernail or something.
Yes, you're talking about that slight indentation that
the indentation there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's literally believed that when he was drawing the map, he had his finger on the map, and so he drew around the finger. That's why it's called Churchill's fingernail.
He's British.
Yeah. So, yeah, the borders between Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the borders between Jordan and Iraq are completely non-meritorious. There's no reason it should be there and not, let's say, 5 kilometers to the south or 5 kilometers to the north. Okay. We then talked about how within the British Mandate of Palestine, you began to have the cultivation of chief rabbis. And the Sephardic community, primarily representing the Jews who had lived there previously, as well as those Yemenite immigrants we talked about in the first Aliyah, were sort of a separate Jewish community from the Ashkenazi Jews. And the Ashkenazi Jews appointed as their first chief rabbi one of the first rabbis to embrace what we're going to call religious Zionism. We're going to talk a lot more about that today. And that's Abraham Kook. You can see on the left-hand side. Abraham Kook had to really connect the various Jewish perspectives on Zionism to make a religiously viable explanation for how Zionism worked. And he said that, yes, it is the case that Israel is being built primarily by secular Jews, and it's being built along a secular guideline. But what is also happening is that the creation of the state of Israel is making possible the ability for the Messiah to return. So these secular Jews, unbeknownst to them, are cultivating a society that will eventually lead to a theocratic state and will lead to a Jewish, religious sense, Jewish state, not a Jewish ethnic sense state, which was Herzl's goal, right? And so it was permissible for Orthodox Jews to engage in Zionism, knowing that they were going to support and develop the kernels of Judaism in these secular Jewish souls and make them burst into flowers of true Jewish religious observance and create a state that would bring about the end times and the Messiah. On the Sephardic side, you had Ben Zion Meir Uziel, and he was really important in patching relations between the old Yishuv, the Jews that were indigenous to the territory, and the new Yishuv, the Jews who had immigrated from Europe. In many respects, the Jews who were indigenous felt that they weren't being respected and they weren't part of the kibbutzim that were being built. And they also had a different set of customs and traditions because Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews don't have the same modes of dress, they didn't have the same food customs. And he sort of patched up that divide. One of the things that people tend to think, though, is that European Jews are somehow more modern or more egalitarian or somehow more developed than the Jews of the Middle East, and that's not the case at all. In fact, Abraham Kook and Uziel actually disagreed on whether it was permissible for women to vote in Palestinian mandatory elections, with Rav Avraham Kook saying it was not permissible for women to vote, and Ben Zion Meir Uziel saying that it was, in fact, permissible for women to vote. Now, this is probably the most important divide that we're going to have, and it's going to show up throughout the rest of Israeli Zionist history, is really the division between labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism. And I sort of chose these two leaders because they really symbolize the key division here. Dov Baruchov was one of the most famous labor Zionists. He was primarily active in the 1920s, and he spoke in specifically socialist terms. He talked about the end of the capitalist state. He talked about the creation of large labor unions. He talked about socialist collectives and other ways of living that fit within that paradigm. And he saw that through working with the land, through developing the land of Israel, that Jews would be able to connect to their Judaism and also create a strong social national character. This view has kept throughout the state of Israel and is today embodied by the Labor Party. No surprise in naming there. And this view has become increasingly marginalized as time has gone on, but in the beginning, they were the dominant voice. On the right side, you have Zev Jabotinsky. We've talked about him before because he served in the Zion Mule Corps during World War I. And Jabotinsky was primarily interested in the idea of how to build a state and make it resistant to Arab takeover or Arab invasion. Initially, he proposes a binational state, but he increasingly becomes reticent towards the idea that Arabs can effectively be part of a Jewish state and understand the Jewish needs for self-determination. So he's much more private-oriented and much more militaristically oriented. And this movement that he leads is called revisionist Zionism. So one of the first major institutions that the labor Zionists build is what's called the Histadrut. And the Histadrut is still a huge part of the Israeli economy. It represents over 800,000 Israeli workers today. And it was one of these initial Zionist institutions. It was created in 1920. And it covers almost all aspects of the organized Israeli economy. So there are four businesses that I sort of want to talk about to give you a sense of the scale and scope of the Histadrut. The first one in the lower right-hand side is SIM. You've probably seen these containers somewhere or other. This is Israel's shipping company, and it is a nationalized company of the state of Israel. They ship all over the world, and they were responsible for the largest influx of goods in transit into Israel throughout the mandatory period and still today. You have Solel Boneh. Solel Boneh is Israel's national infrastructure company. They build almost all of Israel's major industrial works, from its desalination plants to its power grids to even entire cities have been put together by Solel Boneh, where those cities are intentionally planned and developed. You have Bank Hapoalim, which is the skyscraper in the lower left-hand side. Bank Hapoalim means the bank of the activists. Bank Hapoalim was the financial center of mandatory Palestine for the Jewish community and for the first 3 years of Israel's high-growth economy. And finally, you have Clalit. Clalit is Israel's national health service, which was also organized by the Histadrut and started collecting donations in the early 1920s. Israel does have private health care, but most people in Israel are covered by the public healthcare service, of which Clalit is the dominant member. And you can see in the upper left-hand side the current building of the Histadrut, which is in Tel Aviv. You can see how massive it is, and as I said, it coordinates labor throughout the entire country. Now, at the time of Israel's independence, over 3/4 of all working Jews were members of the Histadrut. Currently, as I said, it's only 800,000 employees, which is about 20% of the Israeli workforce. But as I said, it represents a huge swath of the Israeli economy. Now, until the 1970s, Arabs were not permitted to become members of the Histadrut. Only Jews could become members.
Why? Why did they exclude Arabs from the Histadrut?
Because the Histadrut was designed to empower the Jewish creation of the creation of a Jewish homeland, and so the idea was that Jews would be participating in this mission, not Arabs.
So what was the idea in those early days? Always to exclude the Palestinian Arabs?
No, it was more the idea that they didn't think that the Palestinians would be interested in these projects. Right? For example, if we look at Solel Boneh, right? Solel Boneh was supposed to build infrastructure for the Jewish state. So we're talking about power grids and things like that. The Arabs wanted their own organizations and control over electricity and power. They didn't want to be dependent on the Jews, right? And the Jews at the same time didn't want, somebody that they thought they couldn't trust, or they didn't know if they could trust inside these formations.
Richard,
So, yeah.
would it be accurate to say that the kind of the unifying concept of all of these Jewish organizations was the conviction that anti-Semitism was an irreconcilable, insolvable problem, and the only way the Jews could survive is by building their own institutions and say it's us against them?
Yes, to a certain degree, but this was primarily operating in Israel, right, where anti-Semitism was starting to build. But in 1920, when the Histadrut was founded, that was not the case. It increasingly became the case as time went on, but by that point, the organization was sort of set.
But you said that Jabotinsky had a military bent.
Sure.
But there hadn't been an attack, as you said, since the 1830s up in the north.
No, I just talked about Tel Chai and the Nebi Musa riots in 1920.
Oh.
And there becomes increasing strife after that point,
Okay.
because it becomes clear once the British take direct control that the Jews have an aspiration towards creating an independent Jewish nation state, and the Arabs are resistant to that notion. And in fact, here we get to the Jewish and Arab militias. So I hope Zach's still listening. So we've got.
I'm here.
Yeah. No. So the first Jewish militia to form and organize is called the Haganah, and it's represented by the sword and the olive leaf that's over it. The Haganah was formed in 1925, and and sort of developed in sort of two directions. There were those who left the Haganah because they believed that because the Haganah had a principle called Havlaga, which is that they should be self-restrained in their action. They should only be a defense force. They should not be an offensive force. And so they did go from kibbutz to kibbutz and defend them from Arab attacks, but they wouldn't go and target Arabs for intentional violence. There were those who disagreed with this approach, and they split in 1931 to form what was called the Irgun, or Etzel. You can see that as the map of Israel and Jordan together with a rifle between them, right? That's the symbol of the Irgun. The Irgun has been labeled by some as a terrorist organization. Probably the best parallel would be the IRA. They were responsible for violent attacks. They were significantly smaller in number than the Haganah. And the Haganah and the Irgun often disagreed over tactics and targets. The Haganah also had an elite unit called the Palmach, which is represented by the sword cutting two sheaves of wheat. The Palmach was a highly specialized group of agents who worked for the Haganah and was primarily mobilized in the 1940s. The Irgun was no enemy to splitting either. In 1940, there was a disagreement among the leadership of the Irgun as to whether they would support the British or oppose the British in World War II. The argument, of course, was that they had been opposing the British up until World War II, but now the British were fighting the Nazis, and the Nazis are probably a worse enemy to Jews than the British were. And so most Zionists in Israel took the opinion that Ben Gurion stated most eloquently: we will fight the Nazis as if Palestine were not a thing, and we will fight the British as if the Nazis were not a thing. So to have two separate approaches, but to coordinate to a certain degree with the British, because we were fighting on the same side against the Nazis. The Lehi disagreed and believed that the British were actually the enemy, period. So they split. They even had several moments of outreach to the Nazis to try and facilitate some sort of agreement for support against the British. Nothing really came of those negotiations, and the Lehi was very small, but they did have several important assassinations, such as of Count Folk Bernadotte in 1949, which is why they're on the map. One of the leaders of the Lehi was Yitzchak Shamir, who eventually did become prime minister of the state of Israel. One of the leaders of the Irgun was Menachem Begin, who we'll talk about, who also became a prime minister of the state of Israel. But also members of the Haganah have become leaders of the state of Israel. So, but between those periods and now, there's been a lot of complication. On the Arab side, there aren't as many unified fighting forces. Probably the most important one is represented by the Palestinian flag at the top, which is the High Arab Committee, the Al-Lajna Al-Arabiya Al-Uliya, and that gave birth to the Jaysh al-Ihad al-Muqaddas, the Holy War Army. Yes, they wrote holy twice. The Holy War Army, which was led by Hajj Amin al-Husseini himself, right? We saw that Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He leads this army. And the second group was led by the Arab states and commanded by Fawzi al-Qawqji. We'll talk about that in a little bit, which is the Jaysh al-Qadr al-Arabi, the Arab Liberation Army. But the Arab militias were much less unified, much less well-trained, and much worse organized as a general principle. All right, so we've been talking a lot about what European Jews are thinking, what European Jews are doing. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about what Middle Eastern Jews were doing and what their political opinions were. So on the left hand, we have Menachem Saleh Daniel. He was an Iraqi Jew. He was part of the Iraqi Ottoman government before that dissolved, and he became part of the British authorities when the British began to rule Iraq. Menachem Saleh Daniel espoused the predominant view among Iraqi Jews, which was that Zionism was not necessary for the Jews of the Middle East, that they could be part and parcel of the states in which they lived. And it was deeply dangerous to associate with Zionism because it would cause unnecessary strife with their Arab neighbors for the Jews who were already living in Arab countries. Then you have Ezra Menda. That's not a picture of him. I couldn't find the picture of Ezra Menda, but that's somebody who probably looks very similar. He was a Jew who grew up in Syria, and he noted by the mid-1930s the prevalence of Nazism in the Arab context. There was a huge influence that the Nazis had in the Arab world for two primary reasons. The first one being that the British and the French were the enemies of the Nazis, and the British and the French were the enemies of the Arabs, in that they were the colonizers. And the second one being that the Nazis had this idea of a supremacist ethnic group, that one group of people, the Aryans, of course, in the Nazi case, were superior to all other peoples and deserved to rule over their territory and expunge them. Furthermore, the reason that the Aryans did not achieve this success was that Jews had been stabbing them in the back. This idea was very popular in Arab circles. They just replaced Aryan with Arab, and they believed that the Arabs were a superior people. They had been gifted the Quran, which is the divine document of God, and therefore they should be at the top of the world. The reason why the French and the English, in the ideas of these anti-Semitic Arabs, could not defeat the British and the French was that the Jews had defected toward the side of the colonizers, and therefore served as a fifth column, and they needed to be expunged. So this parallelism between the Nazi Aryan supremacism and a latent Arab nationalist Arab supremacism led to a sort of kinship. And of course, Syrian Jews, like Ezra Menda, wrote that they didn't want the French to leave, specifically because they felt that if the French ever did leave, they would be subject to mass retribution and perhaps death. You have Sir Ali Kaduri, who is a wealthy Iraqi Jew. He and his family were primarily active in Hong Kong and in Shanghai, where he was responsible for creating numerous financial institutions and profiting from numerous real estate investments as well as opium sales. Now, Sir Ali Kaduri wasn't a person who visited Israel, but he donated to numerous different educational institutions that were built throughout Mandatory Palestine. He was responsible for setting up 3 different Alliance Israelite schools, and he is responsible for making numerous land donations after purchasing the land. And finally, you have Murad Farag, who was an Egyptian Zionist and Arab nationalist. He was in favor of an independent Egypt, and he believed that for himself, he would be part of the Egyptian state, but he also believed that the Jews had a right to independence and their own state in Israel, and that the Egyptian nationalism, he felt, and the Zionist nationalism, he felt, were two visions that could build a Middle East together. He wrote and lived almost entirely in Egypt, and he wrote documents in both Arab newspapers and in Hebrew language newspapers, and towards the end of his life also in French newspapers.
Was this growth in Arab nationalism, was it directly connected to what was going on in Europe with the growth of nationalism, the results of the Versailles Treaty, the preference for small, ethnically united states over large empires like the Ottomans? Is there a direct connection intellectually?
Absolutely. Nationalism doesn't occur in the Middle Eastern context until it comes in from Europe. The earliest time we see it is with the Young Turks in 1908. They have the Young Turk Revolution and create a Turkish nationalism, and that inspires the exclusivity of Turkish nationalism begins to sow the seeds of Arab nationalism, because prior to Turkish nationalism in the Ottoman Empire, you had Arabic language schools, you had Turkish language schools, you had Hebrew language schools, you had numerous different languages that catered to the different populations of the empire. After the Turkish nationalist revolution, the Young Turk Revolution, you began to have the replacement of Arab schools with Turkish language schools. And Arabs felt disenchanted by this. They felt like the empire no longer represented them. And so they wanted an empire that explicitly would represent them, and took the ideas from the Turks, and they took those ideas also from the Europeans. When the colonization began, they began to be exposed more to European style nationalism, which is why it shows up exactly the time that it does. Now, the Yishuv realizes that they are still in the minority during this period of the Haganah in the 1920s and 1930s. And so what they begin to do is outreach to the minorities. The first minority with which they have the best success is actually the Bedouin. You can see Bedouin from the north in this photo from the Galilee. Contrary to popular belief, while there are Bedouins in the southern deserts of Israel, the Negev desert, there are actually more Bedouin in the north of Israel, in the Galilee region, close to Tzfat and Tiberias. And so a lot of the Yishuv reached out to these Bedouins, and in turn for helping these Bedouins get access to water, protect themselves from Falah, right? We talked about Falah, these settled Arabs, right? So the Bedouins are the nomadic Arabs, Falah are the settled Arabs. And in terms of protecting them from the Falah, they became good and steadfast allies of the Yishuv. In fact, there are numerous cases of Bedouins speaking Yiddish from that generation because of how closely they worked with some of the earliest immigrants from Europe before Hebrew became standardized as the dominant language of the region, which did happen in the later period of the British Mandate. On the left-hand side, you see the Circassians. The Circassians are a small minority population. Today, they number about 4,500 people in Israel. Their original home is in southwestern Russia. And the Circassians almost uniformly were on the side of the Yishuv. They saw themselves as being very culturally similar to the members of the Yishuv. Since many of them had fled Russia, they spoke some Russian or understood some Russian. So when the Jews came there, they had that common language, they had common food, and also the Circassians were less wedded to an idea of Arab nationalism because that would be exclusive to them as well. So the final group that the Jews really reached out to were the Druze, which you can see on the upper right-hand side during a protest in 2012. They were protesting an action in the Syrian civil war. And they're waving the Druze flag, which is that flag with the triangle and the four bars.
Circassians were Muslims?
Circassians are Muslims, they're Sunni. But they weren't Arab, and so they didn't connect with Arab nationalism. They
were part of the ethnic group that was recruited as Janissaries?
I don't know if Circassians particularly were recruited as Janissaries, and I would doubt if they were, because for Janissary recruitment, you generally went after Christians and converted them to Islam, and the reason for that was that they would have no family ties.
Right.
Since Circassians were already Muslim, there was nobody to convert. There are a lot of Circassians in Turkey today, but that is because they were expelled from Russia, and the Ottoman Empire accepted and welcomed them. And so Circassians are all throughout the former Ottoman Empire. There's Circassians in Jordan, Circassians in Iraq, Circassians in Turkey, but the Turkish population is by far the largest.
Well, I don't know if if you remember, but Mamluks had Circassian, you would say, sultans or kings, whatever they call it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, the Mamluks. Yeah. All right.
Suleiman's wife was Circassian too, right?
Correct.
Suleiman's wife. I think Roxolana was from southeastern Europe. I don't think she was Circassian.
I think she was Circassian.
She was Ukrainian.
Ukrainian?
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
E. Lawrence used to, masquerade as a Circassian when he would conduct forays into Turkish-controlled territory. He's a blue-eyed.
I'm aware of, but yeah, it makes sense. It's probably the only ethnicity you could pass for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Druze had a much more fractious relationship with the Yishuv than the Circassians or the Bedouins did, and many Druze didn't want to break away from the Arab communities if they didn't have to. That said, they saw the Jews as a third player, and in cases where you had Druze and Sunni Arabs living in the same village and they had fractious tribal disputes, oftentimes the Druze would be more willing to side with the Jews because they could have that support then in their own internecine struggles. Now we get to the revolt of 1936 to 1939. So increasingly through this period, the Arabs are becoming more and more agitated by the size and strength of the Jewish immigration, which by 1935 had reached to the point where they were nearly 400,000 people out of a total population of, I want to say, 1.5 million at this point. So they can see the writing on the wall that there is going to be a Jewish state. In fact, you can see in the center what are called the Notrim. The Notrim are Jewish police officers from the Haganah that have become part of the British occupying authority. They've been deputized. So you have these Haganah police officers, and you can see they've even made a Jewish star with their rifles as sort of a show of their Jewishness. So you had a growing antipathy towards the way the British were handling things. And at first, the general view of the Arab High Committee was to negotiate with the British. The British were the problem. They should be opposed. The Jews should not be opposed. But Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who you can see on the left-hand side, was a Muslim cleric who came from a Sufi background in what's now Syria. He moved to Palestine and began, after fighting in Libya, several other engagements. He fought in Libya in 1911 and in several other engagements. He came to the belief that no, both the British and the Jews need to be opposed. And so he set up his own strike force to attack Notrim, these Jewish police officers. And one of them, Rosenfeld, was killed. So he and his followers were tracked to a mountain and they martyred themselves. Now that martyrdom led to a wide outcry throughout the Falah population, the settled Arab population in Palestine. And they led a revolt. That revolt was militarily commanded by Fawzi al-Qawqji, who's the man in the center. It was very badly disorganized. And there was a dissent now between Fawzi al-Qawqji and Haj Amin al-Husseini, who commanded the rest of the revolt. The British were able to defeat the revolt and restore security, but they were sure after 1939 that they wanted no further Jewish immigration because they didn't want another conflagration like the one that they had seen. And so they issued what was called the White Paper of 1939, which limited Jewish immigration to only a trickle. That low level of Jewish immigration meant that during World War II, when the Jews would have needed to immigrate most, that they couldn't do so. You can see on the right-hand side negotiations with the Arab High Committee. Starting in 1939, the Arab High Committee absolutely refused to have any meetings with the British where there were Zionists in the same room. So the British would meet once with the Arabs and then once with the Zionists in order to make any progress. And you can see Chaim Weizmann in the circle. The reason for this convocation in 1936 was during the Arab Revolt, Lord Peel was told to find a solution that would work for creating a Jewish and an Arab state that would work. And so he proposed the map that you see in the center, where the Jews would get the Galilee region and down the coastline, the Arabs would get the vast majority of the territory, and there would be a small conclave for the British to rule, which would include Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Zionists accepted the plan with numerous comments and disagreements. The Arabs profoundly rejected the plan. The Arab position was that they were the majority of the territory. They shouldn't have to lose any of their land. Conversely, the Zionists believed that this would be the beginning of their aspirations to have true independence. You can see on the lower right-hand side a Jewish march in favor of, I believe it's in favor of adopting the Peel Commission, but yeah. Now, as we mentioned, during World War II, there was a division between the Jewish desire for independence and the Jewish desire among the residents of mandatory Palestine to fight the Nazis. And so you have both of those things going on. On the left-hand side, you have Chana Senesh. Chana Senesh was a member of the Haganah. She was born in Hungary, which is why her name is spelled as it is. She was born there, and the British trained her as an SOE, a special operations. I forget what E stands for a special
executive. It's called executive.
Thanks.
Yeah.
A special operations executive, and her mission was to go into Hungary to infiltrate and to find out key information about defenses of the state. Unfortunately, by the time she had been dropped into Yugoslavia and set to cross the border, Hungary had been occupied by Germany. Because remember, Hungary was its own ally of the Axis until 1944, when Germany actually formally occupied it. And when Germany took over, they changed up the border positions, and Zohana Senesh was arrested at the border. She is a famous martyr in Israeli memory, in that she resisted all kinds of torture and interrogation and gave up no information about her fellow special operations executives, and she also compromised nothing about the British or Jewish war aims. You can also see David Ben Gurion, who is at this point beginning to lead both the Haganah and the larger Zionist conferences taking place in Israel, as it's becoming increasingly clear that a Jewish state is on the horizon. But in order to make it a reality, there still needs to be numerous attacks against the British in order to force their hand. So you see in the upper right-hand side a train derailment, which was planned by the Haganah, specifically one of the Palmach divisions, and that took place in early 1946. The tracks were blown up, derailing the train. And of course, in the lower right-hand side is the King David Hotel bombing, which was perpetrated by the Irgun. In the hotel bombing, 91 people were killed. And the King David Hotel was attacked primarily because that was the seat of the British government, and the Irgun were trying to cripple it.
Is there still a King David Hotel or no longer?
I believe it's been rebuilt.
There is still a King David Hotel. It has the best breakfast brunch in the world.
It'll just blow you away.
I've never seen so many variety of things that are available. It's absolutely amazing. It's a fabulous hotel.
Was it a bottomless brunch, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, they had like 3 or 4 different rooms. In one room is the smoked fish room, and one room is the fruit room, you know.
It's the bomb.
What's that?
Oh, God. Okay.
It's the bomb.
Yeah.
It was, I got to tell you, I still, you know, it was really a fabulous experience. And it's only, you know, it's walking distance from the walls of the old city. In that picture that Richard showed, you can see the walls of the old city behind the ruins.
Yeah, they're right here. Yeah. Anyway. All right. So, of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust, was responsible for the death of 6 million Jews and 5 million others. But what's relevant for the issue of Zionism is that after the Holocaust ended, you had numerous what were called displaced persons camps throughout Europe. And these displaced persons camps were often on the physical sites of the former concentration camps or very close to them. These were Jews who had been forced out of their homes. Their homes were likely occupied by other residents from those countries. By other countries. Other countries' people, and they really had nowhere to go. And even if they did have somewhere to go, they had no way to get there. So you had these camps all across Europe, and many of the Jews in these internment camps wanted to either go to America or go to Israel. And so there began to be an increased clamor to go to Israel. In fact, you started having what were called illegal immigrations. You had, because the white paper of 1939 was still in effect, Jewish migration was still limited. And so people tried to take boats to Palestine. Many of them made it through, some of them did not. Those that did not make it through were sent to Cyprus, where they went to Cyprus detention camps. You can see a picture of the Cyprus detention camps at the bottom. The Cyprus detention camps were only emptied when Israel became independent and was able to start receiving those detainees. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the primary backer for the state of Israel during this period was actually the Soviet Union. Gromko saw how socialist leaning, Gromko was the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations, and he saw how socialistly leaning the Israeli government was, how dominant labor was, the Histadrut, all of these institutions, and projected that Israel would become a communist satellite state in the Middle East if it were given independence. And other Soviets had the same view as long as Stalin was alive. So they were agitating in favor of an Israeli state. And Abba Eban, who was Israel's first ambassador to the United Nations, and before then, of course, an avid diplomat, met with Gromyko on numerous occasions. You can see on the lower right-hand side.
Who
And
was
of course,
Gromyko at the time? What position he
Soviet ambassador to the UN.
to the UN? Okay, yeah. I
Later, he
remember
was
him.
foreign minister, I believe. So
Yeah, he was foreign minister
he was
when
around
I
for a
was
long
there.
time.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
him very well, but I didn't realize.
Under Khrushchev and Brezhnev.
Yes,
Yes.
Correct,
foreign
yes.
minister. Yeah.
No, I mean, he like the thing is that the Soviet Union at the highest level supported Israel, and he's a representative of that.
Yeah,
And then of course,
Stalin was the first, Soviet Union was the first state to recognize Israel, I believe.
Well, that's actually eventually caused the severe anti-Semitism by Stalin later on because of his disappointment with Israel.
Well, I heard that Stalin.
That's what the case of doctors. That was a result of his reaction to.
Well, his major reaction was to set up the autonomous Jewish area.
But that was
the
before the war.
autonomous Jewish
That's
area was
before
created
the
in the
war.
1920s.
Yeah, that was before the war. He said, but he actually planned to do mass relocation of Jews there as a result of change of course by Israel.
And on the U.S. side, John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State, was strongly against recognizing Israel. It took Abba Eban convincing Truman to meet with Weizmann that led to Truman overruling Dulles and deciding to take a pro-Israel stance. The American Jewish community was divided on the question of Zionism at this point. Many more were convinced than had been because of the results of the Holocaust and the increasing global awareness that if Jews don't have a home, there's no future for them. But it wasn't as uniform as Zionist support in among Jews is generally seen today.
Yeah, well, the State Department was populated by graduates of Ivy League schools and places like that, and they were quite anti-Semitic at the time, as shown up in their opposition to immigration of Jews before the war to the U.S. It's also funny, on the personal side, Truman's wife was viciously anti-Semitic. She wouldn't allow a Jew in the house. So Truman's role in all of this is very interesting because he was a Bible reader and he self-identified as Cyrus, actually. He's been quoted on that.
So
self-identified. He thought he was Cyrus?
No,
yes,
no.
A modern Cyrus.
Modern, yeah, exactly.
He never said it in public, but
he wasn't delusional.
So now we get to the Israeli independence conflict, right? So the map on the left shows the possessions of Jews. So the areas in blue are privately owned Jewish properties. The areas in in green are those owned by socialist compounds or the JNF, right? The Jewish National Fund, which bought large swaths of territory. Now you can see that they own roughly 7 to 10% of the territory of mandatory Palestine. And it's primarily along the Mediterranean coast and then towards Lake Tiberias. Those are the dominant areas.
That blue line there pretty much corresponds exactly with the Jezreel Valley.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and the tip over there is the city of Haifa. This is the most fertile farmland in the whole Near East.
Yeah, that's correct. And the UN resolution gave to the Jews, because in 1947 they passed UNGA Resolution 1812, and that resolution was for the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state with a corpus separatum, which would be internationally ruled to govern Jerusalem. Now, the Jews received 56.5% of the territory, while the Arabs received 42.5%. But recognize that about half of the Jewish territory is actually in the Negev desert, which is sparsely underpopulated. The reason why the Jews were allocated that territory at all was that Ben Gurion Ben Gurion pushed quite strongly for controlling the Negev desert, so that way they would have a direct route to the Red Sea. At that point, Ben Gurion wanted to make sure that there was at least something, a way that Israel could get out if something happened on the Mediterranean coastline, if they got blockaded or there was some other attack, that there was another way for Israel to move. Now, if you exclude the Negev desert, which is practically devoid of people, the territory is split much more evenly than it is if you include the Negev. Regardless, a lot of the territories allocated to Jews were areas where Jews did not live. And in fact, as you can see from the population, within the Jewish state, the vast bulk of the population, 49.2 and 50.8 are right, but that it would be pretty much, it was 55-45 Jews to Arabs in the Jewish state territory. In the Arab state territory, there were practically no Jews. As soon as that passed on the 29th of November, there was an internecine conflict that started between the Jewish militias that we talked about, the Haganah, the Palmach, the Irgun, and the Lachi, against the Palestinian militias. It's believed that the Palestinians started it, but it remained an internal conflict within the territory, and by and large, the Jews were winning. But at this point, on May 14th, 1948, which now, of course, is 6 months into the conflict, Ben Gurion decides that he will declare the state. And so he does so in that picture we saw on the title screen. Upon his declaration of the independence of the state, several things start happening. You start having mass immigration from Cyprus, right? All those detained people from the detention camps. You start having people from IDP camps in Europe coming in. They get off the boats and they're handed a gun and told to go to the front. Israel also has the ability to negotiate internationally, so they start getting weapons from Czechoslovakia, which are provided indirectly from the Soviet Union. And of course, on the military side, Arab armies from Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, and along with units from Saudi Arabia and Yemen invade the country. Now, the main theater of the war is actually that protuberance from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, because the Jordanian army was the best trained out of all of these armies, and the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was probably the most difficult part of the war to win. But what ends up happening is that the Israeli government manages to take even more territory than they were allocated under the UN partition plan by the time all the armistices are signed. So we then arrive at the map that we're familiar with. You can see on the right-hand side. Now, one of the things that also happens during this conflict, which starts in November 30th of 1947 and ends on April 21st of 1949, is that you have the Nakba, which is the massive depopulation of Arab citizens. Now, there are debates as to which cities were depopulated through aggressive tactics, which ones were willingly depopulated, but regardless, you had numerous Palestinian towns and cities that were depopulated. Now, one of the things that Israel did was that they passed numerous laws that said that if a Palestinian had fled during the conflict, they couldn't come back after the conflict had ended, that they had ceded their right to stay in the territory. Conversely, those Arabs who did stay in the territory and made agreements with the Jewish militias at the time, like the Haganah, like the Irgun, those Arabs had the right to stay in their own property. And so in 1952, Israel passed what was called the Citizenship Law of 1952, and granted citizenship to any Arab who had been living continuously in the territory from 1946 to 1952. They also had passed the Law of Return in 1950, which granted citizenship to any Jew who could prove his Judaism, basically. So you had Arab citizens and Jewish citizens in this new state, but the Arabs who left could not become Israeli citizens.
And where did they go?
Most of them, they went to the UNRWA camps. We're going to talk about that when I talk about Palestinianism. So you can see on the map all these red dots. Those Palestinian villages had the majority of the population or all of the population leave during the conflict, and it never returned. So Israel then set about demolishing these villages, yeah, that's what's left of them. Now you have Arabs, even you have Arabs in the Israeli Knesset, even from the first Knesset. One of the Arab members is Saifuddin Zubi. He came from Nazareth. He's a Sunni Muslim, and Saifuddin Zubi was actually part of the governing coalition, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. Of course, you also have the opposite, where you have Tawfiq Ziad, who's also an Arab citizen of Israel. He grew up in Tiberias, and he was protesting on several occasions against what was martial law. After the War of Independence, Israel put all of the Arab majority towns and cities under martial law until 1966. And so Tawfiq Ziad wrote poetry and protested these laws. He was jailed, and it's believed that he was tortured on several instances. He later became a member of the Knesset, always in Arab parties, and always outside of the governing coalition. So I guess one of the things that we didn't discuss during the war was the formation of the Israeli army. So during the war, you had these numerous different militias, and when Israel became a state, one of Ben Gurion's primary actions was to create the Tzava Haganah L'Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, and so he disbanded all of the different units and put them into sort of a Haganah command that he called the IDF. He especially disbanded the Lachi and the Irgun after the attacks at Deir Yassin, which was a Palestinian village in which roughly 120, I believe it's 107 Palestinians, civilians were killed by the Irgun and the Lachi. So he disbanded them and started criminal prosecutions against them. Later, though, many of the individuals who had been criminally prosecuted, if not all, were pardoned by the administration. So at this same time that you have this large-scale exodus of 720,000 Palestinians from mandatory Palestine, you have an incoming of Mizrahi Jews. Now, there are 850,000 Mizrahi Jews who left in this period. So actually more Mizrahi Jews left the Arab world than Palestinians left nascent Israel. However, 350,000 of them went to other countries. They went to France, to the United States, to Britain, to Canada, but 500,000 of them went to Israel. And the country was in no state to absorb them. The entire population of Israel after the war was 700,000. 600,000 Jews, 100,000 non-Jews. And this population of incoming was 500,000 over the course of 7 years. So it was a massive population change. And in order to accommodate it, Israel built these camps called Ma'abarot. You can see the camp in the upper right, in the upper center. The Ma'abarot existed from 1950 until 1957 with the intent to integrate the Mizrahi Jews into the Israeli state. Now, there were numerous difficulties in terms of doing this. Some of them are the result of the patronizing attitude that a lot of Ashkenazi Jews had towards the Sephardic Jews and the Mizrahi Jews, and some of them have to do with just cultural differences and styles of life. Mizrahi Jews tended to be more religious than most of the secular Zionists who had built the state, but they weren't at the same time either Hasidic or ultra religious. So they were more animistically, you could say, religious. They believed in amulets and totems, and there's a degree to which that was seen as unscientific. Now, I wanted to also provide a contrast between the communities that came. You can see on the right-hand side Jews from Tunisia, and you can see on the left-hand side Jews from Morocco. Jews from Yemen. So you can see that there's a wide swath of different levels of education, westernization, style of dress.
Richard,
yeah.
How easy was it to distinguish the Mizrahi Jews from the Sephardic Jews?
Well, Sephardic is a rite. It's a way of worship. So most Mizrahi Jews are Sephardic by right.
Okay.
The people. So I was just using those terms interchangeably at the moment, but obviously there are Sephardic Jews from, for example, from Turkey. You don't see it on this map, but in 1943 there was what was called the Velik Vergisi, which was a Turkish tax that was leveled against all minorities in the country, including the Jews, and it was considered a poll tax. It was incredibly expensive, and a lot of Jews in Turkey felt that when Israel became a state, that they shouldn't live in Turkey anymore because Turkey wasn't their country. And so those populations that came from Turkey would be Sephardic, but not Mizrahi. There are also populations from the northern part of Morocco that are also Sephardic, but not Mizrahi, because they're originally from Spain. But the other populations were overwhelmingly Mizrahi, but Sephardic by right.
Okay, so the North African Jews were Sephardic and Mizrahi generally, most of them?
Yes.
Okay.
And the same with the Jews of the Middle East.
Yep.
My understanding is that a lot of these people, Israel built settlements in really very out of the way, poorly served areas with no infrastructure, and basically trying to create facts on the ground, and sent a large number of these immigrants basically out to live there, and created a kind of grinding poverty that persists to this day.
It doesn't persist to this day, but yes, that is correct. There were a lot of changes that occurred in the 1980s. Things have changed significantly. But from the 1950s to the 1980s, the Mizrahi form an underclass in Jewish society.
What about the Falashas of Ethiopia? Is that in this period?
The Falasha come a little bit later, in the 1960s and 70s, but they're treated even worse than the Mizrahi are. Although the difference is that they are repeatedly flown out of Ethiopia, right? The Israeli government goes to collect them. So during the 1950s and 1960s, you have what is called Mapai, which is when Mapai is the name of the coalition. When that coalition goes defunct, it becomes the Labor Coalition. And of course, the leader of the Mapai coalition is David Ben-Gurion, who begins a number of projects to build Israel using the Histadrut and the other massive state institutions. One of the things that Solel Boneh does is it builds the national water carrier. You can see pipes for the national water carrier being laid out in the inset picture, and you can see the route of it on the upper picture, where you can see how it goes from Tiberias all the way through Israel, all the way down to the Negev. This was a massive undertaking to reroute millions of liters of water per day from the Sea of Galilee to build settlements throughout the Negev. Ben-Gurion's idea was that, of course, having the access to the Red Sea was critical, and so populating the Negev was part of that. And you can see the Sde Boker. Sde Boker was one of these townships in the Negev that was brought to life by the national water carrier. And it was actually where David Ben-Gurion decided to retire when he retired from politics, because he believed in building the Negev. Now, during this period, Israel experienced a phenomenal economic growth, spurred by such a large influx of new population and the ability to get contracts from outside of the country. The country really thrived. And the man primarily responsible for this is Pinchas Sapir. You can see him in the square photo. He was the Minister of Finance from 1963 to 1968, and again from 1969 to 1974, and the Minister of Trade and Industry in 1955 to 65 and 1970 to 1972. Now, of course, some of those years overlap. He had both portfolios in those years. Now, he was famous for carrying his little black book, and he would go everywhere to talk to different industrialists throughout the world and try and find a way to get them in his little black book of investments for the state of Israel. Now, because of the centralization of the Histadrut and other elements of the Israeli economy at this time, he was actually able to effectively implement a centralized planned economy to a certain degree, using this little black book, as opposed to the much more decentralized way of the free economy that Israel currently works on.
Can you just address where the Soviets during this period stand?
Sure. From 1949 until 1953, the Soviets were the primary allies of the state of Israel. In fact, wait, sorry. Here's the slide for that. So until 1953, the Soviets were the primary benefactors of the state of Israel. And what Israel decided to do was what they called the Alliance of the Periphery, where you can see in blue, Israel, Turkey, and Iran were the periphery surrounding all these Arab states. And so Israel made an alliance with Turkey, and they actually had a very strong alliance until 2010, and an alliance with Iran, which held strong until 1979. That alliance allowed them to focus against the Arabs, and supplied with Soviet weapons, they were able to defend their own territory. In 1953, the Soviet Union turned away from Israel, believing it to be too much of a capitalist state and too reliant on the United States and Western Europe to be part of the Soviet sphere. Additionally, at the same time, the Arab states were looking more favorably towards the Soviet Union, and so it seemed like a win-win to avoid further entanglement with the Jewish state. And so France and Britain became the primary benefactors of the state of Israel, and that took place from 1953 until 1956. In 1956, Israel fought a war against Egypt called the Tripartite War, or the Suez Crisis. In that war, it was the Americans under Eisenhower who forced Israel to return to a status quo antebellum. And by demonstrating how powerful the United States was to do this over the French and the British, the Americans had effectively pushed them out of the Middle Eastern theater in terms of their foreign policy. And then by 1967, you see a shift towards the United States being the dominant pro-Israel party in the region, seeing the Six-Day War victory as a marker of Israel's long-term survivability. So, yeah. So we have the economic growth. During the 1960s, we also see the Orthodox Jews re-examining Zionism and whether or not it's an acceptable discipline. And two of the leaders in the Orthodox world who begin to change the perception here are Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson and Joseph Soloveitchik. We met Joseph Soloveitchik's grandfather, Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, and so yeah, the grandson, though, unlike his grandfather, was pro-Zionist. He strongly supported the growth of Israeli religious institutions, as did Menachem Schneerson. Both of them believed that the ingathering of Jews to Israel was a positive phenomenon, and basically said that now that Israel exists and it is a Jewish state, we should make it a Jewish, in a religious sense, state. We should be supportive of it. We should pray for it. You have the development of numerous yeshivot in Israel during this period, such as Yeshivat Har Hamon. Yeshivot Har Hamon was first presided over by Rav Kook. We met him. He was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, and then later the first chief rabbi of Israel. And this is a yeshiva where most people who study here actually will serve in the military, because it has this nationalist bent to it. You also see a much larger and increasingly large population of Orthodox in the country. The Orthodox are the fastest reproducing segment of the Israeli population. At independence, they're about a minuscule percentage of the population. Now they're about 12% of the Jewish population of the country. And one of the agreements that Ben Gurion makes with the Orthodox is that the Orthodox have one portfolio of ministries that they will never lose, which is the life cycle ministries. So they're responsible for birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates for the Jewish community of Israel. And if you are a Jew, you are responsible to them regardless of whether or not you are Orthodox by denomination.
So in other words, the secularism took leave at this point?
No, the Israeli government is primarily secular, but when it comes to life cycle rituals, those are religious. So the Israeli government actually divides on that sort of issue, right? So if you are Muslim, there's an imamate, that is the Israeli imamate, and they officiate over Muslim marriages, and they're responsible for the Muslim rules of divorce, which makes, of course, religious intermarriage illegal under Israeli law. One of the workarounds that was developed about 30 years ago from today, in the 1990s, was that Israel will recognize any foreign performed marriage as long as any foreign performed marriage. So most religious couples will go to Cyprus to get married. They'll be married in Cyprus, and then they'll come back to Israel, and their marriage will be recognized as a Cypriot marriage.
So is there any civil marriage?
No.
No, okay.
Richard, I just coming back, I just want to clarify, the Americans became main benefactors of Israel after the War of '67, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, because I remember it was mostly like French airplanes.
Yeah. Yeah. During '67, Israel flew Mirage 3Cs.
Right.
And is there gay marriage?
Only foreign accepted marriage, right? So if you get married in Spain has gay marriage, and you have a gay marriage and come to Israel, Israel will recognize that as a foreign marriage. But until any one of Israel's religions accepts gay marriage, there is no legal gay marriage in Israel. So then you have Arab socialism. And the real standard bearer of Arab socialism is Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was, he promoted this in Egypt, and he promoted the idea that all Arabs together needed to create a unified country. And as you can see, Israel sits right in between the countries that would be part of his United Arab Republic, which is in red. So Israel, of course, was something that needed to be eliminated. The Palestinians needed to be restored to their own sovereignty, and this was the beginning of a clear anti-Zionist doctrine in the Arab world. The Arab socialists made it clear that they were opposed to any manifestation of non-Arab nationalism, of which Jewish nationalism was one of these types. But at the same token, they were not in favor of, for example, they fought a war in Sudan primarily to prevent blacks from asserting nationalism. So it was the idea that Arabs should rule, and it should be an Arab state in its cultural orientation. And you start to see propaganda. Now, this propaganda that I found was, I tried to find something benign, or as benign as it could be. And this is actually from the Muslim Brotherhood about the current peace treaties between Israel and the Emirates. So it's not directly on topic, but you can see the Jew is reaching out a bloody hand saying, I'm here in the name of peace, take my hand. And the Arab says to him, we're so blessed to have your help. And you can see that the blood is noted as the blood of the Palestinians, right? That the Jew has killed the Palestinians, and the Arab sheikhs, who are gluttonous because they've gotten fat on oil, are ignoring the Palestinian plight to enrich themselves.
I'm always petrified, and when they depict the nose, it's so distinct.
Yeah.
Not all the Jews have that long pointy nose.
Yes.
That is
Right. That's exactly what I was going to point out.
What does it say on the suitcase, Richard?
Al-Anzama, the system, like the way things are working.
And Richard, with Nasserism, is that when Christians start to flee the Middle East?
Christians flee the Middle East throughout the 20th century. It comes in waves. From Egypt in particular, there is some flight under Nasser, but it's not bad because under Nasserism, Copts are considered Arabs. Copts don't consider themselves Arabs, but Copts were considered Arabs by Arab nationalists, so they weren't directly targeted. And Copts have never manifested a form of Coptic nationalism because there's no area of Egypt in which Copts are a majority, so it wouldn't work. So Copts have almost always fought for civil rights and equality. However, lightly they've done it. Yeah, and I wanted to point out,
and the other key thing about Coptics is that they represent this sort of Egyptian creation mythology going back thousands of years. So there's this direct lineage. So having a space for them, as long as they're not a threat, allows this sort of continuity of sort of the Egyptian greatness over time. I mean, that's a side piece, but it's there, and obviously Coptics, like you said, are there's small little districts that they used to have, a minority majority percentage of people living in, but a lot of those have been even cleared out in the last 20, 30 years.
The Egyptian government will not allow an accurate census of the Copts, but it's estimated it's about 10% of the population. But
it's probably less. It's closer to 8%, I think.
Are they ethnically distinct in any way from?
What?
Are the Copts ethnically distinct in any way from the Arab population?
Well, the thing about Arabization is that Arabization was a cultural process much more than a genetic process, right? So you can think about it in the same way of Sinicization, right? The populations of China actually look different. If you go to different parts of China, people don't all look the same. And even though they'll identify as Han, they identify as Han because their culture has been overwritten, right? And so they take on the Han culture, and it's their culture, but they're not genetically different than, for example, the Miao in the mountains. Which is that those are the ones in the mountains who resisted cultural assimilation, and the ones in the lowland who identify as Han, who look exactly the same, are those who are culturally assimilated.
Exactly, and like you have the same thing in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. I mean, the people can sort of be indistinguishable, but they'll have radically different cultural kind of milieu and social behaviors and habits and everything else. And even obviously they've existed along the Nile Delta for whatever, hundreds of thousand years or something, right? So
I believe there is a linguistic relationship all the way back to the ancient Egyptian language, and I do believe that Champollion credited spending time in Coptic churches with the breakthrough that he made to be able to decipher hieroglyphics.
Yeah, that is correct. Coptic, it's only a religious language now just used in services. Nobody speaks it, I believe, spontaneously, but it's a direct descendant of ancient Egyptian. I mean, it's radically different structurally. It's changed quite a bit, but that's accepted by everybody. So,
well, the Coptic Pope and the Coptic Council still speak it. So, but it's a tiny percentage.
That's always an interesting question. They can speak it, but how well?
But I wonder if because of the religion, they stayed Christians, if they resisted any kind of intermarriages with Arabs.
Well, it's the other way around, right? The Copts who intermarried are Muslims now.
Right. So I'm saying genetically,
the ones who remain are the ones who didn't, right? But it's not. But we don't know if the community as a whole didn't intermarry. In fact, the more logical assumption is that the majority of them did intermarry or did convert, and that we only have a shell of that population today, with the majority of them identifying as Arab, with maybe, let's say, 15 to 20% Arabian admixture.
Sure, but those who identify as Copts right now would be more kind of related to the indigenous population without any influence of Arabic genetics. I assume.
And I mean, there's constant pressure on the population. So as an example, you can't be a commissioned officer in the Egyptian army or as a chief warrant officer as a Coptic, but you can rise as far as you can as a non-commissioned officer. So there becomes this sort of pressure for some people to obviously convert. Now, how much of that is real conversion versus sort of like Jewish Catholic conversions of the Middle Ages? But it's the point is that there's this constant pressure through the socialization mechanisms in Egyptian society. So it is a long-term project of ethnic cleansing, basically.
But so I just wanted to sort of round out this page, right? You can see that that the Jew has many stereotypically defined Jewish aspects, right? The large nose, the hat, the suit. Interestingly, right, the dress of style that is typically used in Arab anti-Zionism is traditional Orthodox Jewish garb, right? They're not dressed like David Ben Gurion. They're not dressed like Joseph Trumpeldor in like a military fatigue. They're not dressed like modern Israelis, with a polo shirt and pants. They're dressed like religious Jews, which are ironically the population that they're not dealing with. And one of the aspects of Arab socialism is that Nasser predicated a lot of the strength of the Arab people on their military power. There were a lot of allusions to the Arab conquest in the 600s, and he made the argument that the Arabs would rise as a military power as well, which is why there's the Egyptian tank up there. Egypt considered itself the defender, the physical defender of the other Arab countries, and so in 1965, when Israel threatened Syria with an attack, because Syria had been attacking several Israeli positions on Lake Galilee using its high point in the Golan Heights, Israel threatened a retributive action. Nasser moved his soldiers closer to the Israeli border over the Sinai, which was not permitted under a number of the resolutions in 1957 that ended the Suez Crisis. And the only reason he did it was to defend Syria as a fellow Arab state. And Israel used the violation of the UNEF zone to justify the preemptive attack on the 6th of June, as well as the 5th of June, as well as the blockading of the Straits of Tiran.
So Nasser was like a neo-Ottoman.
But the Ottomans are Arab. The thing is that the vision of the future that Nasser actually held is actually very American, if you sort of think about it this way, right? You have this city on a hill. We had this great empire. We will have it again. And the thing is that we stand together, divided by country, but united in spirit. E pluribus unum. So it's much closer to that idea. And he was very non-religious. There are actually clips of him listening. Like there was a woman with a hijab who came up to him, and she said, "When will it be normal to wear the hijab?" And he starts laughing. Like it's such an absurd question.
Remember that the end of his movement was, the last bits were Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad.
Yeah.
They're the last Baathists.
Yeah. Yeah. No. As Arab nationalism moves through time, it takes on increasingly religious elements because it has to cater to a population that's moving through a religious shift.
But
But the population.
Nasser was not a Baathist.
No, he wasn't.
He was an Egyptian army officer who took power.
But this idea of
There was a Baath party in Syria and in Iraq, and that was the limit, actually.
Yeah, but he was a nationalist, and that's the key.
Yeah, he was.
this notion of a pan-Arabic
Exactly.
nation.
But he was much more benign in his behavior, I think, than either Baathist party over time, anyway. But yeah, it could have worked out the rise of sort of the Arab great religious Islamic awakening.
Right.
Usually dated to the 30s. It wrecked all of this, and it could have worked out much better, but it did not.
Muslim Brotherhood. When was that concept?
Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1935. The Muslim Brotherhood was active throughout this period, but they were heavily repressed by the Egyptian government. The only time the Muslim Brotherhood has been allowed out of jail in Egypt was the one time that they ruled the country, and then everybody put them back in jail. So yeah. All right. So in 1956 and in 1957, the chieftains of the Druze and the Circassians came to the Israeli Knesset and basically ordered is sort of a harsh way to say it. Ordered the Israeli military to compulsorily draft their citizens, but only the men. In Israel, everybody is subject to a mandatory draft. However, the military can choose to exclude certain populations if it deems it fit. And the military has excluded all non-Jewish populations from the draft, and certain Orthodox populations because of some laws that have been passed limiting the number of ultra-Orthodox who can be drafted. Now, as I said, in 1956 and 1957, the Druze elders and the Circassian elders came to the Israeli government and demanded that their sons be drafted. And so now the Israeli government doesn't make the exception for Druze men and for Circassian men. You can see here in Isfia. Isfia is one of the three major Druze cities in the Galilee. You can see the Druze elders in the back with their caps towards us, and you can see the Druze military recruits in the foreground. And it's a ceremonial procession. It is estimated that 369 Druze have died in defense of the state of Israel. The number of Circassians is far lower because the population is much smaller. On the right-hand side, you can see an Israeli military commander addressing, I believe it's Druze families, about recruitment and other sort of changes in the military, because recruitment goes at a very local level in Israel.
Could you remind us who the Druze are again?
Sure,
I know you've told us.
Yeah, the Druze are a minority ethno-religious group. They are derived from Ismaili Islam with elements of Gnosticism and with elements of Gnosticism and Christianity thrown in. They have their own holy book called Rasail al-Hikmah, Epistles of Wisdom, and they've had a number of tensions with local Sunni Muslims in the area. So
I think in Lebanon they also have a problem with Shia Muslims as well, right?
Yeah, no. The problem is that people are religiously intolerant, and Druze don't fall under the Muslim rubric, and they don't fall under the Christian rubric, and so.
And I mean, they've really been persecuted for.
It's worse than that because they're apostates, right?
Exactly.
Correct. Yes.
Right. They used to be Muslims. They fell away, and
right.
That's much worse than someone who's never been associated with Islam at all.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a good book last year published on exotic Middle Eastern religions, and I know the Yazidis were hated by. This is off topic again. The Yazidis were so hated by.
Well, the reason the Yazidis were
because somehow in their theology, Iblis became a good guy, so they're regarded as devil worshippers by Muslims. So
right. It's not that Iblis becomes a good guy; it's that the character that they worship, Melek Taos, has a lot of the same attributes as Iblis.
And there's a difference between Sunnis and Shias when it comes to their treatment of Druze. So, there's one is more extreme. And the same thing with like Sufis. So Sufis get along with Druze very well, typically. So the more edge sects tend to have a better relationship with Druze. So
yeah, the Druze remind me of there is a Western equivalent, the Cathars in southern France in the medieval period. They had the same Gnostic element, belief in secret knowledge that was only revealed to they were called perfecti in the Cathar movement. But the papacy launched a crusade against them and massacred a whole bunch, and they disappeared from history. But it was very similar. Theologically, anyway.
Where do the Kurds fit in to the story?
They don't.
Sunnis.
they don't. Yeah, they don't.
Mostly.
Oh, you mean like in the constellation of Muslims, or do you mean like in the story of Israel?
Both.
Well, in the story of Israel, they don't. I mean, Kurds and Jews have a good history together. Jews have lived among Kurds for centuries, and there's some Jews who identify as Kurdish Jews, but beyond that, nothing. In terms of the constellation of Muslims, Kurd is an ethnicity, and because Kurds are a mountain people, it's basically a number of different tribes who have fled from lowland persecution, and so you have a large religious diversity among the Kurds. The majority are Sunni Muslim, but there are Shiite Muslim Kurds called Faili. Yep. There are Yazidi who speak Kurdish language. It depends who you're talking to, whether they're Kurds or not.
And there's even secular Kurds. I mean, so there's a
and there are Christian
massive,
Kurds and Jewish Kurds.
Yeah, there's a massive diversity, and a lot of it is the intersection of where amongst the four countries they're sort of sandwiched in and sort of how they overland in those countries across the
And,
mountain.
Kurdish is an Indo-European language?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's related to
It's
Persian.
Iranian. Iranian is not just the Persian language spoken in Iran. There's a whole bunch of Iranian languages spoken across the Middle East into Central Asia. I mean, Dari and Pushtu are Iranian languages too.
Well, Dari is actually just Farsi.
Yeah,
Dari is,
it's another name for Farsi. You are
yeah,
correct.
it's just an accent.
But
And since we're
they
talking
look
about,
very similar to each other. So with
Yeah.
obvious variations. So.
since we're talking about all of this religion, I just wonder, it just came to my mind, why are the Baha'i ended up in Haifa in such like a significant community?
Baha'u'llah was subject to Baha'u'llah, their prophet, was subject to persecution,
Exactly.
and he fled to, and he was imprisoned in Haifa for several years. And so the place where he was imprisoned, that became the Baha'i World Center.
Interesting. Because I know in India, I was in India, there was like the largest Baha'i temple is in India for whatever reason.
Well, no, the thing is that India tolerates a lot of religions that have been persecuted in Iran, like Zoroastrianism as well.
Yep.
India just doesn't persecute minority religions.
Yeah, you have over 250,000 Zoroastrians in India.
Yeah,
So,
Parsis, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Parsis. So now Baha'i stay out of the Israeli system. They do have their world center in Haifa, and Baha'i are there, but Baha'i actually have believe, religiously speaking, that they should not proselytize in Israel. That Baha'u'llah gave them a command that Israel already has so much religious stuff going on that the last thing Baha'i need to do is to cause increased strife there. So they don't proselytize in Israel, and accordingly, the Israeli government just sort of leaves them alone. And they don't serve in the army, but there's very few of them anyway. There's like a few hundred or a few thousand. Now, the interesting thing is that because of the heightened service that the Druze and the Circassians have, as well as the Bedouin, though, join the military voluntarily, they're not drafted. These three communities tend to see themselves as having a blood pact, less with the Bedouin, but especially with the Druze and Circassians. And they consider this blood pact to mean that the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is something that they have given their lives for. And so they disagree with the Arabs that there should be a democratic non-Jewish state in replacement of Israel or instead of Israel. They see themselves as having fought for this particular state, and they want it to endure as this particular state with all the rights and privileges that they've had under that state. Now, as we mentioned, the Mizrahim were a political underclass throughout the 1950s and 60s, and primarily fit in the place of the labor needs for the Israeli government. Now, they, because they were primarily excluded or ignored by the Mapai coalition, which was governing from the left, the parties that governed from the right were those that were able to get them as a population, which is a very interesting situation, especially for those of us who are Americans, where the conservatives tend to be people who have a longer history in the country, more connected with the wealthy and the elite, a strong sense of government. In Israel, it was exactly the opposite. The governing historical entrenched populations were left wing, and so it was the right wing that catered to the poor and disenfranchised. And the dominant party here is Histadrut. You can see the symbol for Histadrut on the right hand side. If you remember, it's exactly the same symbol as the symbol for the Irgun. Many of the leaders of the Irgun reconstituted themselves as the leaders of this Histadrut political party. And throughout the 1950s and 60s into the mid 70s, the Histadrut party was a minority party, which was not part of the governing coalition. However, Israel's economy changed after 1973 with the Arab oil embargo, which led to a decrease in faith in the left-wing government, and led Menachem Begin, who was previously a leader of the Irgun, to become the prime minister of Israel. And you can see him on the lower left-hand side. It has traditionally been the case in Israeli politics since this point that Mizrahi Jews tend to be more hawkish and Ashkenazi Jews tend to be more dovish, with the exception of Russians, who also tend to be hawkish. And so the right wing in Israeli politics is dominated by Russians and Mizrahim, and the left wing in politics is dominated almost exclusively by Ashkenazi Jews. Which is why I've always personally found it funny when I talk to some Arabs and they think that the Jews who will sympathize most with them are Jews from the Middle East who live in Israel, and it's like, no, you've got the wrong group of people. It's yeah. Anyway, so the 6 Day War, as we mentioned, changes everything. You can see in the upper left-hand picture Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, who succeeded who came before Menachem Begin, but after Ben Gurion. He was still part of the Mapai Labor Coalition, meeting with Lyndon Johnson. The two of them became collegial after the victory. Now, you can see in the 6 days, Israel conquered 4 distinct territories. They conquered the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in Syria. Now, the goal of UNSC Resolution 242, which ended the conflict, was that Israel would return these territories in response to peace offerings from the Arab countries, recognition. And the Arabs in the Khartoum Resolution of 1967 stated numerous things, but most importantly, they said that they would have no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel, which meant that Israel was holding pretty on this land that they'd taken. This led to the creation of the military governments in Gaza and the West Bank. As we mentioned before, the Arab Israelis in Israel proper from 1948 until 1966 were under military rule within domestic Israel, but that was, as I said, abandoned in 1966. Now in 1967, that kind of military government is spread to the occupied territories. So Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and the Golan Heights are subject to a military government. In the West Bank, this military government endures. Sinai has since been returned to Egypt. The Gaza Strip is since independent as part of a Palestinian state ruled by Hamas. And the Golan Heights has come under civil law in 1981.
Is there any significant population in Sinai other than on the Mediterranean coast?
Oh, absolutely. There are cities all along the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, and you have the city of Sabah and Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a famous resort town. But in terms of the vast size of the territory, it's mostly empty. Yeah, and Port Said on the north side, which was the Mediterranean side. During this period, from the 1960s onward, you begin to see American Zionism really developing. The first major group advocating for the state of Israel was the American Zionist Committee for Public Action, the AZCPA. The AZCPA became APAC, the American Israel Public Action Committee, after it was renamed in the 1960s. APAC is probably the most powerful single lobby in the U.S. government. Obviously, it doesn't get everything it wants, but you can see it even convinced Barack Obama, who's had lukewarm feelings towards the state of Israel during his presidency, to give a speech there. Almost every American president has given a speech there. Probably the most important, though, lobbying group for the state of Israel is not Jewish. It's CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which is represented by the emblem in the center. CUFI was organized in the 1970s by a number of evangelical Protestant pastors. Their argument falls under several lines. Some of them have said that they support Israel because of certain apocalyptic beliefs where they need Jews to be in the Holy Land, but the majority of them have disagreed with that notion and said that they don't support Israel for those reasons. They support Israel because there is a passage in the Bible that says those who bless the Jews will be in turn blessed. And so they support Israel from those grounds. They support it as a restitution of the prophecy of Ezekiel, that the Jews will be returned to their land as a show of God's power. And they see the creation of Israel as being itself a divine miracle. There are currently 7 million registered members of CUFI, and there are probably about twice or thrice that in terms of Christians who hold the same ideals as the organization, just simply aren't members. On the right-hand side, you have the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, which is another Jewish lobbying and organizational group that represents a number of the vast panoply of American Jewish organizations. These groups have been, this leadership has been consistently Zionist in its outlook, and has supported advocacy for the state of Israel in the United States. And then, of course, there's the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which was formed to facilitate relationships between Christians and Jews in America. And they have provided direct aid and support to Israel. So you see lots of different sides of Zionism occurring in America. AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents have really galvanized the American Jewish population and led to an acceptance of Israel that is relatively high among the American Jewish population. Any questions?
Are you finished or?
No.
This is not a question, but there's a Sunday profile in the New York Times. An Israeli sociologist argues that Trump voters, like Netanyahu supporters in Israel, have legitimate reasons to find liberal values threatening, and he is a Mizrahi Jew.
Yeah, no, I actually don't disagree with some of the critique that's being made. I just think that Trump isn't like, if you're saying that this is the trouble and this is the critique, Trump isn't the one who's making an eloquent representation of that critique. I mean, there's a lot of things to say about him. Eloquence is not one of them. So anyways, in 1979, we have a massive shift in Israeli political and foreign policy strategy. Right, we remember that Israel had the alliance of the periphery, right, which was Israel, Turkey, and Iran. As Iran shifts to become the Islamic Republic, the translation here kills me. The Persian is death to Israel, the Hebrew is death to Israel, the Arabic is death to Israel, and the English is not. But you have Iran shift to an Islamic Republic. Relations with Israel are broken. Despite this, Israel actually provides Iran support during the Iran-Iraq War, hoping to reestablish relations with Iran. This fails, of course. At the same time, Israel makes peace with Egypt. Anwar Sadat, it can be seen there shaking hands with Menachem Begin in the Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords returned Sinai, but not Gaza, to Egypt. Gaza remains under Israeli military occupation until it gets independence in 2005. And the Sinai is returned to Egypt in waves. In 1979, up to the red line is returned. Then the blue line in 1980. And then the green line in 1981. And then up to the Israeli border in 1982.
Did the rapprochement with Sadat, was that in any way related to the Iranian Revolution of the same year?
No, they just happened contemporaneously.
It was before, so like it took some time.
It started in 1978, but the Camp David Accords were signed in January of 1979, and the Islamic Revolution also started in 1978 and ended with the Shah's started, however you want to phrase it, with the Shah's abdication at the end of January 1979 as well.
So were the two unrelated, or were they related?
The two are unrelated, but but in Israel it forced the shift towards Egypt, right? It wasn't just Egypt coming to the table because they wanted Sinai back, which was of course the case. Sadat had gone to war with Israel Egypt had gone to war with Israel in 1956. First in 1948, right, the Independence War, then the Suez Crisis in 56, then the Six-Day War in 67, then the War of Attrition from 67 to 1970, then the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and Egypt had lost every single one of these encounters except possibly the War of Attrition. Sadat realized that there was no way that he would be able to take Sinai back without a peace treaty, and so he staked his life on it, and that's exactly what happened. An Islamic militant named Islam Babouli shot Sadat in October of 1980. And he was celebrated actually as a hero in Iran. There's a major street in Tehran named after him. So now we've talked about how in the first 3 decades, Israel had a booming economy. At some points, the economy was growing at 10% per year. But with the 1973 oil embargo, you had what was called the lost decade, where Israel struggled to maintain growth. There was some growth, but it wasn't anywhere near where it should have been. And then in 1983, there was a mass inflation, and the shekel became incredibly devalued, leading to the production of the new shekel, which is Israel's current currency, which was issued in 1986. Now, one of the ways that Israel recovered was that when right-wing governments took control of the economy, they lessened the power of the Histadrut and allowed new segments of the economy to develop that would be based on a venture capital and free market model. The largest section of these, of course, is the technological and scientific industries. You can see the Weizmann Institute of Science in the lower right, which is in the city of Revolt, which is sort of south of Tel Aviv. You also have on the upper left-hand side the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, which allows trading with all kinds of new startups in Israel. And in the white building, you have the Jerusalem Venture Partners, which is one of the largest venture capital firms based in Israel. Israel has a huge capital venture market, especially in buying and selling new startups. Israel also developed in the tech industry by leaps and bounds and secured numerous offices from global companies, from Siemens to Microsoft to Apple. And these less regulated industries that are outside of the Histadrut managed to pull the Israeli economy forward in the late 80s into the 90s and aughts. So at the same time, while Israel is developing, you also have what I call Palestinianism. Palestinianism is the idea that the Palestinian Arabs are a unique people. Now, of course, there were documents that say the word Palestine or use the word Palestine to refer to Arabs before 1948. But the idea that this is a cognizable and unique ethnic group really develops in the post-war period. You see numerous triangles across the map. These are the UNRWA camps. And the term camp is rather misleading. You can see the Rafah camp in the upper left-hand side, which is a complete city. You can see how buildings are made with stone and bricks. Roofs of steel. It is not like the Ma'aburot. It is not just a set of tents. These are actual cities. And they exist throughout the Middle East. You can see there are a number of them in the West Bank. There are a number of them in Gaza as well. There are some in Egypt, throughout Lebanon also. In fact, in Lebanon, they represent 10% of the Lebanese population, although they are not counted as Lebanese. There are throughout Syria and throughout Jordan. The first development of Palestinian national identity was the creation of the All-Palestine government, which administered Gaza while Gaza was under Egyptian control from 1948 until 1959. It was collapsed by the Egyptian. Until 1957, the Egyptians. It was kicked out of Gaza when Israel conquered the territory in the Suez crisis. When that land was given back to Egypt, it was put under direct Egyptian military rule. So the All-Palestine government was ended as a functional entity, and it was moved to Cairo. You can see an All-Palestine government passport. The government was a puppet government of Egypt and did not represent the national aspirations of the Palestinian people. You then had numerous Fedayeen massacres, which were primarily led from the Jordanian side across, because Jordan controlled the West Bank at the time, over the Israeli border. These were Palestinian militants who were either paid or supported by the Jordanian government, and they would attack Israel and then go back over the border. In return, the Israeli government put together special squads, one of them led by Ariel Sharon, to go over the Jordan side and attack, and imposed curfews on a number of the Arab towns along the border with the West Bank. In the upper right-hand side, you see a memorial to the Kfar Qassam massacre, which was when one of these Israeli patrols returned back to Kfar Qassam, didn't realize that it was a territory within Israel, and slaughtered 57 I believe, Arabs in the street. And so this is the memorial in Israel to all the martyrs who died in this false fire operation, false flag operation. Now, the Palestinians have made, so from 1948 until 1968, the Palestinians made no real attempt to govern themselves. After that point, the people began to rise up, noting that the Arab leaders were not going to do anything in their interest. The first real engagement was called the Battle of Karameh, which occurred in 1968, very close to the Jordan River. And this was and the Palestinians fought Israeli tank divisions that had just taken the territory, right, in 1967. They won the West Bank. And the Jordanians actually chose to reinforce the Palestinians. From a military perspective, the Israelis trounced both the Jordanian and Palestinian military, but it sent a clear wave throughout the Palestinian world, right, because now they're separated throughout all these different countries as refugees, that it was possible to resist the Israeli government. The question then came for the Palestinians as to how they could effectively resist the Israelis, and they turned towards Jordan. You can see King Hussein in the upper left-hand picture after the Battle of Karameh, inspecting the battle site. He had the largest Palestinian population in his country. Of Jordanian citizens, roughly half of them at this point were ethnic Palestinians, and there were numerous refugee camps. Yasser Arafat called upon the refugees in these refugee camps to launch an insurrection against the Jordanian government and therefore make Jordan into a Palestinian state. This war continued from 1969 until 1970, and was called Black September. It was 8 months. It's unclear, because there's been no proper historical investigation in Jordan, how many Palestinians died in Black September. The Jordanian government claims 300 Palestinians died. The Palestinians claim that 20,000 Palestinians died. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those numbers. You can see in the lower left-hand Palestinian soldiers at Ajloun, which is a castle on the western part of Jordan, very close to the Israeli border. Those are Palestinian militants holding off the Jordanian government during Black September. After the failure in Black September, where Israel clandestinely assisted King Hussein in maintaining control, believing Hussein to be a better negotiating partner than any Yasser Arafat-led government would be, the Palestinian movement moved around the world. And so there were numerous Mossad, or Israeli intelligence operations, to take out key leaders in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, including a hit in Tunis in 1976. But the largest next concentration of Palestinians to revolt were in southern Lebanon. And the Palestinian, as I pointed out, there were Palestinians made up roughly 10% of the Lebanese population, but they had no rights as Lebanese citizens. They couldn't work, they couldn't leave the refugee camps. And so by this point, they had been living in the camps for 30 years without the ability to naturalize under any schema. And so they fought for a change in the situation and provoked the Lebanese civil war. Israel, of course, intervened in the Lebanese civil war in 1981 when different forces in that war launched missiles at Israel. And Israel controlled southern Lebanon from 1981 until 2000, when Ehud Barak withdrew. You can see a young, cool Yasser Arafat, right, rocking the sort of the Che Guevara design style on the right-hand side. So, in this period where Palestinianism is rising, there's a recontextualization of the Arab-Israeli conflict. From being a conflict of the various Arab states against Israel, you can see on the left-hand side, where Israel is this small, beleaguered state, to the idea of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where the conflict is really between the Israelis, who are the governing power of a major nation state, and the Palestinians, who are the non-governing, dispossessed people from the same territory. And you can see the image from Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions, which makes the claim, right, that, quote, the white territory was land open to Palestinian development, which of course was not the case. In 1917 and in 1948, those lands were not open to Palestinian development any more than anybody else, because they didn't own most of those territories. Most of those territories were owned by the British government, or in 1917 by the Ottoman government that preceded it, or large-scale landowners who were outside of the territory, absentee landowners. In fact, ironically, the largest Palestinian state is in the Today map, where all of those areas that are white in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are self-governing Palestinian territories. And it's been the first time that the Palestinians have actually had their own government and their own property on a national level. But the recontextualization allowed for a narrative of imperialism and colonialism, showing the Israeli military control of the West Bank and Gaza as being combined with the creation of Israeli settlements in those territories as being a form of settler colonialism.
And Israeli control the border with Jordan, right? Right now.
Yes.
Yeah, because before they didn't, right? Now they do.
No,
right?
the border with Jordan was always Area C.
Yeah.
So Israel controlled that territory. Now they annexed it. So it's de jure, and so under Israeli law, it is de jure part of Israel, as opposed to before, where it was de jure under military occupation.
Quick question.
That's the distinction.
And one other, oh, sorry, go.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, one other, oh no, go ahead, Zach, sorry.
No, go ahead, Aaron. I'll go after you.
I mean, the Black September movement, which is sort of 2 to 3 phases really, is actually very understudied. It was actually, I mean, a devastating strategic error because after what they attempted to do in Jordan and what they were doing is trying to recruit other Arab governments to revolt to support them, because the Jordanian the Jordanian monarchy is Hashemite, and the Hashemite claim to to Ali, and going back to the foundation of Islam, and so after that though, they basically lost an enormous amount of their support and trust for obvious reasons, because who wants to support someone that could turn around and try to over government, and it was even worse than that, because they had 2 assassination attempts on King Hussein, and they actually assassinated the prime minister of Jordan, and so they were really sort of blown apart, or attempted to blow them apart, and Syria sort of accepted, under Assad, that hey, let's let me get a try at him, basically, and use Lebanon as sort of a playground, and then he couldn't even sort of contain what they were trying to do, and then ultimately they broke apart in different regions of the world, and then that became several of those cells became the cells in Munich that during the Olympics in 70, in 73. So actually it's really a fascinating component to this, because of the legacy and the overhang in the lack of support that the PLO ultimately had over the decades, and really in some ways continues to have.
I have a question. Thanks,
Yeah, go ahead.
So 1975 to 1990 war in Lebanon, how much of it was incited by Palestinian? So
Well, the thing is that it was a powder keg before.
Yep.
This was the thing that lit it. So you can ask the same question: how much of World War I was incited by the Black Hand? Like,
no, in Lebanon you have right. You had about 55% Christian before the war, and 45% Muslim.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Something around there, and then it was clearly a delineation between those two, and it wasn't.
It was actually a 3-way war. It was between the Christians, the Sunnis, and the Shiites. All 3 of those were separate parts.
Yep.
And all of those populations were over 20% of the population. But the thing is that, right? But it goes, but like the question of how much is it, how much were the Palestinians responsible for? It's the same like how much of World War I is the Black Hand responsible for?
Yeah.
Like they caused it, but it underscored a lot of serious issues and inequalities that were going on in Lebanese society, and the fundamental issue is that the Christians and the Muslims had very different ideas about what Lebanon should be. The Muslims generally wanted it to be an Arab state. The Europeans wanted it to be a European. The Christians wanted it to be a European aligned state. The Arabs wanted it to be more anti-Zionist. The Christians were lukewarm on the proposition. But at the same time, the Christians wanted, a strong relationship with Cyprus, and the Arabs weren't that interested with that. Like there were a lot of different issues that basically came to fruition once the country sort of descended into chaos.
Right. All right.
I have a comment where it says, "What a strange interpretation of Lebanese civil war, which was created by Israeli territorial and refugee crisis and Israeli alliance with extremist unchristian elements." The Israeli alliance with the Christian elements only started in the 1980s. So the I find it kind of absurd to say that Israel caused the Lebanese civil war when it was the Lebanese Palestinians who revolted. Now, you could make the claim that if the Palestinians were never ejected from Israel, that they wouldn't have revolted in Lebanon. But you could also make the argument that if Lebanon had sometime in the last 30 years given not even citizenship right, but just residency right to the Palestinians and allowed them to work and live normal lives, that they wouldn't have been in such a position to be radicalized. The problems with Lebanon, the reason why Lebanon entered a civil war is not because Israel forced Lebanon into a civil war. It's because Lebanon had serious inequalities and issues that the various sides couldn't negotiate about. And what started off that conflict was Palestinians fighting back. Okay.
Right. Can I tell one thing, that interesting thing? You probably know about this, but Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader of currently Palestinian Authority, he studied in Moscow in University of Patrice Lumumba, and I always found this really ironic that his dissertation was cooperation of Zionists and Nazis.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard, but that was really crazy.
Yeah.
And actually, Russian propaganda equated Zionists with fascists in 70s. I remember that very clearly.
Absolutely. No. And in his dissertation, he made very clear that he believed that the Holocaust was a myth. Anyway, so as we move into the 1970s and 1980s, we have a clear, especially into the 1990s, we have a division between left-wing and right-wing Zionism. Left-wing Zionism, as epitomized by Rabin, follows the message that there should be two states for two people, and that there should be an exchange of land for peace with the Arab states. The right-wing Zionism is of the belief that there is no way to make peace with the Arabs. Would that we could, but we can't. So what we need to do is we need to remove them as a problem. Now, some of them went as far as the man on the right-hand side, which is Meir Kahane. Meir Kahane was a rabbi based in New York, and he believed in the extermination of Palestinians living within the territory of the land of Israel. And his movement, Kach Kahane Chai, has been ruled a terrorist organization in Israel. Kahane himself was assassinated. You also have similar people with similar beliefs, like Yigal Amir, who you can see in the circle photograph with the kippah on his head. He is the man who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, and he did so based on the belief that Rabin's willingness to negotiate with the Palestinians and create a peace process was going to kill Israel. And so in order to save Israel, he had to kill Rabin. The Israeli justice system did not agree with this appraisal, and imprisoned him for assassination of a sitting prime minister.
Can you just
And the-
briefly remind us, because I got a little lost there, in who had these sort of Nazi-like views you just mentioned?
Sorry?
You mentioned somebody.
Yeah, Meir Kahane.
Sorry?
Meir Kahane, the man on the right-hand side.
And how did he justify those views as much as
He justified those views by saying this is the historic land of the Jewish people. The Jewish state has a right to exist, just like any other national state. The Arabs are antagonistic to that state and cannot be reasoned with. And accordingly, if they won't leave of their own volition, we should make them. That was his argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way the Taliban or the same way any other, extreme group will have a view that is, ultra extreme nationalist, perspective. Actually, there was a really good, I'll try to find it. There was a fantastic, I think it was NPR, show on all of this that ties into the assassination of Rabin, to the point that they interviewed, I'll try to dig it up. They interviewed martyred mothers and families, and sort of that CIA is everywhere sort of belief that people will have all over the world, but especially there. And then also these ultra right-wing Zionists. So the mother of the guy that killed Rabin does not actually believe he killed Rabin. And if he did, it was a CIA plot. I mean, it's just like this really wacky stuff. And even though he's been interviewed, he admits it. He sort of evolved some in prison in 25 years, I guess, and a little bit. But, there is this sort of magical realism that's attached to these movements, which is, traditional of all these types of extreme movements, extreme religious movements, especially when they have a nationalism component, attached to them. There's a whole sociology around it, but I'll try to dig that up. It's fantastic. I mean, when you listen to it, it's remarkable.
Wasn't Kahane's first real political appearance was his organization of the Jewish Defense League in the New York area?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
The JDL.
The JDL.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I grew up in LA, and I remember the JDL running around Santa Monica raising money in the mid '80s. And it was just like there'd be posters. I mean, it was just weird. I mean, it was really weird. And I mean, and I remember when he was assassinated, and it was just wacky. I mean, it was really wacky.
Yeah.
And his group was, really seemed to be some sort of neo-fascist type group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely.
So that's why it was made illegal by, I mean, we know that there are a lot of right-wing Israeli politicians who have said less than kind things about their Arab population. To find his view so reprehensible to make him illegal should really tell you how far beyond the pale he was. Now, in this period, you also have the development of what are called the Chardal, the Chardei Leumi, the religious nationalists. So this is when you start developing Jews who are actually fighting in the units, but are more religious, right? Because the army was historically a secular influence. Now you can begin to see soldiers who are praying and fighting, or praying and studying, praying and fighting. So as we move into the 90s and the aughts, there start to become a wide range of opinions of what the solution should be for dealing with the Palestinian question, right? Which is actually, in a sort of sad way, ironically reminiscent of the Judenfrage, right? This Jewish question of Jews can't live in Europe. What do we do with them? Now Palestinians can't live in Israel. What can we do with them? So you have sort of different solutions. I sort of align them from the most left to the most right. And of course, you have the Geneva Initiative of 2003, which is a two-state solution with land swaps, including a divided Jerusalem. You have the Federation Movement, which is this idea that there should be one state, but it should be divided into cantons. Some are Muslim majority cantons, some are Jewish majority cantons, and they'll have different laws that operate, but a united federal system. And of course, on the right-hand side, you have the Israeli solution proposed by Carolyn Glick, which is basically that Israel directly annex the West Bank, turn all West Bank Palestinians into Israeli citizens, and then go from there, and just end Palestinian aspirations, period. And just hope, yeah. So you have these different solutions from the right and the left, depending on whether they believe that the Palestinians are negotiating in earnest and what can be done. So now, Zionism has of course a slight tension with Judaism. It's perfectly reasonable as a Jew to be a Zionist. It's also perfect. But of course, one is a secular nationalist institution and one is a religion. So there is some tension. You can see on the right-hand picture, of course, most synagogues in the United States will have an Israeli flag. Synagogues in other countries may or may not. And of course, the integration of a secular national symbol into a Jewish religious space is something that is a development of the 20th century.
Richard?
Yeah.
Just quick, if Israel annexed all of the occupied territories, what would the relative populations of Jews and Arabs be?
Well, one of the important things to notice about Carolyn Glick's Israeli solution map is the Gaza Strip is excluded, which is why I put that circle there. The Gaza Strip is about 2.1 to 2.5 million Palestinians. So if you cut that out and you only take the West Bank is roughly 2 million Palestinians. Add that to Israel's 1.8 million Arabs, that becomes 3.8 million Arabs, and there are about 6.2 million Jews. So it becomes 62 to, what is that? It's basically 2/3, 1/3 is how it would shake out. Currently, Israel's population is 4/5, 1/5.
Yeah, the problem is that all of these solutions now are it's like sort of like the carts left the barn, the horses left the barn, right? I mean, it's a lot of the movement in the 90s, which I'm sure you'll get into, is where you had really a lot of more momentum.
Yeah.
And it's that you sort of have a de jure environment now that I don't see how you construct these solutions anymore. I mean, they just don't seem to, the facts on the ground seem to be so locked in.
I think that's right. Some other sort of Jewish aspects. You have the prayer Avinu Shebashamayim, which is actually a prayer created by the Israeli Ministry of Religion for circulation in synagogues to praise and benefit the state of Israel, and to strengthen the hands of the soldiers who defend Israel. So you have this sort of integration between Zionism and religion there. You also have this idea of Jewish diversity showing up in Zionism. Jews from all over the world, representing the return from all four corners of the earth, right? This is a religious concept. From all four corners of the earth, the Jews will return from exile. And so Israel sort of has taken on certain aspects of that in the Jewish world, just as it has in the Christian world. And of course, there are Jews who, as a form of their Judaism, continue to reject the validity of the state of Israel. Like Neturei Karta, you can see in the lower left-hand side. They believe that, similar to the older Jews from the 19th century, that only when the Messiah comes can a Jewish state be created, and therefore Israel is illegitimate. The reason that their position is significantly marginalized now in the Orthodox world is a combination of Israel's survival and the fact that, right, the Talmud agreement was that Israel would be deserted, that the Jews would live among the other nations as long as the other nations did not treat them too horribly. And of course, the Holocaust happened. For a lot of them, that signaled that the other nations of the world had not held up to their side of the bargain, and therefore perhaps it's permissible that the Jews return. And I sort of wanted to leave the peace process alone because I've sort of explained the Zionistic element of it, and I wanted to sort of touch on non-Jewish Zionisms. How do non-Jews understand this phenomenon? And so I wanted to show three individuals here. These are individuals who support Islamic Zionism. That is the idea that in Islam, there is a legitimate reason to support the creation and maintenance of the State of Israel. And so you have Tawfiq Hamid. He is a former member of Jama'a Islamiyya, which is an Egyptian Islamist terrorist group. He left that and became a secular humanist, although he is still a Muslim by faith. And in his view, the Quran has numerous verses, such as 17:104, that say that the Jews will return to Israel, and 26:59, which say that Israel is an eternal inheritance of the Jewish people. And so, from a Muslim perspective, he sees the idea of a Jewish self-governance in the territory as being a fulfillment of God's word. In the center, you have Sheikh Abdul Hadi Palazzi. He lives in Italy, and his view is extremely right-wing by Israeli standards, right-wing Zionist position. He believes that the Quran entitles the Jews to all of Israel and does not give the Palestinians right to dominance. In fact, he argued vehemently in 2005 against withdrawal from Gaza. Now, most Muslim Zionists, like Tawfiq Hamid, are in favor of a peaceful resolution with the Palestinians and a two-state solution. Abdul Hadi Palazzi is opposed to a two-state solution, believing that only a one-state solution is what the Quran intends for the Jewish people. And finally, this is Ambassador Yusuf Al-Taiba. He's the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates to the United States, and was one of the foremost leaders in negotiating the Abraham Accords that were passed in September of 2020. That normalized relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Al-Taiba is a fierce anti-Iranist and fears that Iran will take increased control over the Persian Gulf region. And so he sees a powerful Jewish state as something that will be a bulwark against Iranian power in the region. And so, that's his reason for supporting the State of Israel, not from a belief in the Jewish vision, but in a belief of the need for an Emirati vision, which includes the Jews. You also have the rise of Hindutva, which is a Hindu nationalism in India. And Hindutva is increasingly seeing Zionism as a blueprint upon which it can build a Hindu national state in India, an idea that there should be a Hindu cultural and moral center to the Indian state. So increasingly in India, Zionism and the construction of the State of Israel is positively viewed. Now, this is in contrast to much of India's history, where India tended to be on the Soviet side of the Cold War. It was not aligned, but it tended to be more socialist and less pro-Israel, generally a standard bearer of the Palestinian conflict for the Palestinians. But in the last 10 to 20 years, that has changed with the rise of the Hindutva movement, and especially BJP, which is the current ruling party in India, represented by Narendra Modi. Many Indians sort of see a similar parallel in that Israel is fighting against Islamic extremism, just as India is fighting against Islamic extremism. And finally, I wanted to talk about the white nationalist perception of Zionism. Richard Spencer, famous white, or perhaps infamous is a better word, white nationalist in the United States, has said that he sees his white nationalism for the United States as a white person's Zionism, in the sense that Zionism was the Jews leaving Europe to create their own nation state where they can govern themselves according to their own will, and he sees white nationalism as being a parallel institution to that. Most Jews have rejected this assertion and hold that Zionism is distinct from white nationalism in that Zionism is a return of Jews to their historic homeland, undoing generations of persecution and removal from the land, whereas white nationalism is to create a fake white ethno-state and expel other people who have lived in a territory. The interesting thing about white nationalists is that they are anti-Semitic while being in favor of Zionism, and this seems to confuse a lot of people. The idea is that the Jews in white majority countries like the United States and European countries are individuals who are undermining the whites and preventing whites from governing themselves. That is why they say the Jews will not replace us, in the sense of the Jews will not prevent us from achieving what we are going to achieve. They will not serve as a fifth column. Um, However, they see Israel as the tip of the spear in their war against the Muslims, because they see the Muslims as being worse than the Jews. And at least the Jews have some sort of Western civilization imprimatur, some sort of Judeo-Christian shared ethic. So they'd rather the Jews be in Israel, have a strong state, and have that strong state fight against the Muslims, who are, in their view, completely irredeemable.
Doesn't it occur to them that Jesus was a Jew?
Most white nationalists, especially Richard Spencer, are not actually terribly religious. Spencer himself is bordering on atheism. The Christian nature of white identity to them is actually not that paramount. It is literally just the cultural hallmarks of whiteness.
Yeah, Christianity and Nazism don't get along very well.
Yeah.
Actually, Christian argument on that Jesus being a Jew is that the God has no nationality, and therefore is Jesus. So they do not consider him Jewish because his father God is not necessarily Jewish, or has no nationality.
He's also saying
the old controversies of the nature of Jesus. Was he truly a man? Was he truly God? If he was truly a man, then he could be a Jew.
Yeah, but we're talking about religious people, Christians who do not
I'm just saying that
think.
These are the how many angels dance on the head of a pin arguments that have,
But I mean, even the thing is, like, for them, even if they recognize that Jesus was a Jew, it's like, okay, that was a Jew 2,000 years ago. The Jews of today are the problem I'm dealing with.
Richard?
Yeah.
Richard, the comment, the Jews will not replace us, just to clarify, I don't think that means the Jews are going to take over the United States, but the Jews are promoting the cosmopolitan society. They tend
Absolutely.
to fight for civil rights, for black, for
yeah. But do you think that any of this is really?
What's that?
Sorry, I was going to say, do you really think that any of these statements are really well thought out? I mean, they seem to sound like post facto justification of backing the truck up to fit the facts.
I think that this is their legitimate philosophy. I don't think that they're lying.
I think the question is, of course, people are projecting that the U.S. will be a minority white country in 30 or 40 years. And that's partly what the white nationalists are afraid of.
Yes.
Yeah, but also they believe that as Jewish conspiracy goes, that the Jews, these rich billionaire Jews, control the government eventually, and
Right.
they have these liberal views to replace the white population with all kinds of minorities.
Yeah.
I also wonder, do they have any territorial ideas?
I mean, it's a bunch of when you add up the volume of these people, independent of the people online who are just, promoting the theater of it all, it's always, whenever they try to break this up, it's always down to a few hundred people, rummaging around, kind of nowhereville. I mean, no one's forming company and battalion and regiment size units that are going to form, new, pseudo states. I mean, there's just none of, it's always, 12 losers, not even 12, 3 losers making a bomb that, the FBI saved them from blowing themselves up, basically. If you just let them play with it long enough, they'd blow themselves up 9 out of 10 times. And I mean, that's just, it's a marginal ecology out there of these people. I mean, I truly believe the more we give them space by branding them, the more we actually give them more legitimacy as an average more than anything else. That doesn't mean that the Branch Davidians or, Richard Weavers or, whatever didn't exist, but it's, they all have this apocalyptic, when they go, the movement will take off, and the movement never takes off. What was the guy that was running around the forest in Eric Rudolph, right? The guy that everyone thought, Richard Jewell was the one that did the Atlanta bombing, and it was that guy Eric Rudolph, and in the end, it was just one guy basically that was nuts, and so yeah, I just think when you really look at it in a country of 340 million people, you're always going to get a couple, dozen nut jobs, and and they have a bullhorn, so
Well, there was more than a couple of dozen in Charlottesville, but I agree
no, but
with
I
you
mean,
that
when
it's a very small number.
no, but I mean, when people show up to sort of protest with theater, that's different than people getting in cars and running people over, right? There was one person who did that, and so out of 3,000 people that showed up, one was actually crazy enough to do that, and he'll spend the next 60 years in prison, and and so in the end, these movements, when you really look at them after decades of everyone talking about, right around the corner is the boogeyman, it just, there's never a boogeyman, there's never 25,000 people armed and taking over a state. It's just that is never going to happen here. It doesn't work like that in this country.
Richard, I have two questions. I'm sorry, Aaron.
Yeah.
Two questions. One question is, I don't know, we don't want to get into discussion, what came, chicken or the egg, but obviously, there was, Israel and Judea in ancient times, and Marian, the Roman emperor, renaming the area Palestine, and during the Ottomans invading, it was about 5% Jewish living in there. Yeah. And then again, we're not sure whether there was Palestinians live there, or obviously we know it was Arabs living there, but we don't know if there were particularly Palestinians living there. But how much of a discussion that's happening as far as the territorial belonging or needing? Obviously, we know that a lot of the Christians that are pro-Israel believe that this is the land because of the the fact of religion and right of return and all that stuff. But in putting his non-religious hat, let's just say, how much of a territorial belonging to Jews or Arabs, or this is just a moot point at this point?
I don't even understand what question we're asking.
Question is, does Israel have a right to be to the land, and does Palestinians have a right to the land?
Well, I feel like we've sort of addressed both points, but I'll go over it. I think that Jews have a right to the land because it is the land of their historic ancestors, and they left without choice. They were expelled on numerous occasions, and they also have a right to the land in terms of constituting their own national identity because they've been summarily persecuted in nearly every country to which they've stepped foot. On the flip side, the Palestinians are people who have been living on that land for at least as many generations as they can count. And so they have a cognizable claim to the land as well. Whether or not, that's why I personally believe in a two-state solution. But there are some people who believe that one of these claims is worth more than the other claim, which is why they believe in a one-state solution that favors their own primary candidate. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second question I have is the recent law that was passed by Knesset of Jewish ethnicity and the citizenship.
That's not what it was. It was the Jewish nation-state law.
So how does it change the perspective that you have? What did you say, like 1.5 Muslims living in the country?
It doesn't change anything about the number of Muslims who are living in the country. They are still citizens. Nothing has changed on that grounds. What has changed is that I don't know how in-depth legal we want to get on this. Israel does not have a constitution, or it doesn't have a constitution in the American sense of a singular document that gets amended periodically. Or it doesn't have a constitution in the sense that France has a constitution, which is a document with numerous articles about the construction of the state. Israel has what are called the basic laws. And the basic laws are laws that are passed similar to the way the US passes amendments, in that they require a significantly larger percentage of the Knesset vote in order to pass, and they have entrenched nature. Israel did not have a law, did not have a basic law that had passed that defined the nature of the Israeli state. So the historic way that Israel had defined itself was according to the Declaration of Independence, which has no legal standing, but has a lot of cultural standing and traditionality to it. And the way that the Declaration of Independence defined Israel was as a Jewish and democratic state. The way that the nationality law defines Israel is as the national home of Jewish people with the protections for all other minorities, which is a very different formulation in the eyes of many of Israel's minorities, in that the word democratic is not in that definition. And so they feel that their rights as equal citizens are not being respected. They also feel that by the relegation of Arabic as a secondary language, as opposed to the current situation where there is no basic law and Arabic is treated as a co-equal language with Hebrew, is a diminution of the role of the Arabic language in the country. Even if functionally it was that way, it was not codified that way. And so people could imagine it to be co-equal because nothing had been written down. So the Jewish nation-state law made a number of Druze, especially, feel disenchanted with the state of Israel because they felt that they had made the blood pact that we talked about to fight for the Jewish and democratic state. The nation-state law said that is not what you are fighting for anymore. And so they said, why should we fight for a state that doesn't treat us as equal citizens? Even though functionally nothing has actually changed, except that the state has defined what it is in a way that is more Jewish nationalist than previously conceived.
I have a question, Richard, just sort of a macro level. So the Palestinian attempts to either acquire statehood or dominance or some type of structure that they envision violently, whether it's through guerrilla operations, terrorism, or through supporting wars over the generations, really hasn't been effective in the end. Now, do you see a nonviolent movement ever occurring the same way as Mandela and Gandhi and others? And there were obviously violent components at times, but they were very strategic. In the end, the larger sort of movement was about changing the norms and the mores on the other side over generations. Do you see that type of movement ever occurring? Because I've always felt that that's something that's been just fundamentally missing.
I actually disagree. I think that the South African situation is actually fundamentally different from the Israel situation, and there are several reasons for this. The first one is actually the violence has worked. I disagree that it hasn't. During there's been no progress.
To what end? I guess.
No, there's been no progress on Arab self-governance that has not come as a result of Palestinian violence. That's not to say, like, now the way that they got those things was through negotiations and peace treaties, but the only people who were ever sitting at those tables were Palestinian militants. There has never been a negotiation, as far as I can tell, between, for example, Arab MKs, right, members of the Knesset, between Arab MKs and Jewish MKs to try and create some sort of federated system in Israel. Like the federation plan that I showed you is endorsed by a number of Israelis who are from the Israeli government, but it has never been an Israeli government proposal. The Israeli government has never made any serious concession to create some sort of solution plan with the Palestinians that would compromise on the Jewish and unitary nature of Israel. So, and the only concessions have been made at the point of a gun.
But how much? But how much?
Wait, but let me finish. And the second piece that's key in South Africa is that there was no serious threat from the blacks against the whites, in the sense of the blacks were not often chanting, from the ocean to the ocean, South Africa will be free, right? You don't have this sort of sense. And so there was a lot less delta that the whites in South Africa had to cross to say, we can create a state jointly with the blacks and they will not expel us. There is a huge delta in the Jewish community. They may not be as extreme as, Meir Kahane, but there's a delta in the Jewish community of, if we give in a true equality of power to the Palestinian population, we may see the end of our survival in Israel. We will be forced out of the country.
Can you also comment, if you don't mind, on Ehud Barak and how close or never close he came to actually finding some sort of solution?
I think he came actually quite close. The problem is that my view is that Yasser Arafat promised the Palestinian people a return for the refugees.
Yep.
And without being able to guarantee the return for the refugees to the homes that they had lost. If you remember from the map, there were those 500 villages in Israel proper, right? That's where the Palestinian refugees want to go. They want to go to those villages, and that would be a massive demographic shift in Israel. And Israel would never go for that, and so it's a non-starter. But at the same time, it's a non-starter for Yasser Arafat because he can't bring back anything less to his people. So while they hammered out pretty much all of the border issues, including a divided Jerusalem, it wouldn't work from the Palestinian side. So I don't think that he missed something that could have happened, because it would take Yasser Arafat having the courage to tell his people, we've been fighting for 50 years with this dream, and we're going to have to modify that dream.
But doesn't it ultimately, I mean, can't you ultimately question his strategy and that he couldn't create a phase plan, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and sell that and be able to at least establish the scaffolding of...
But even phase 1 was deeply unpopular in the Israeli public.
Well, I understand that. I get it. But I mean, all deals that are tough are always unpopular with everybody. That's why they're tough deals, right? Yeah. I mean, you know, look at what's going on with the UK and basically the French arguing about fishing rights, right? It's just the same principle. I mean, they're just loggerheads over pointless percentages, but it's the legitimacy of each other that they're fighting over, right? It's not...
Yeah, but I mean, in the case of Jabaz Summit, one of the reasons why why Israelis voted resounding, because Ehud Barak basically said, to show whether or not you have confidence in what I'm doing and you want me to keep doing this, I'm going to hold a vote and then you can vote. And he lost in one of the most decisive Israeli elections in history.
Yeah, but that's just like Cameron, right? I mean, it's like this,
but the agreement that he put forward, for example, divided Jerusalem, which is something that Jews feel deeply sensitive about. The agreement that he put forward would require the liquidation of several settlements, some of them upwards of 25,000 people. That was something that a lot of Jews couldn't make peace with. So it wasn't like a pride issue. It was actually like a functioning issue.
I get it. Now let me ask you this: what's the risk, if we're not already there, of this becoming just literally meaningless outside of the ecology that cares about it and reads about it and sort of consumed about it generationally, in the world we're in as we go forward? And how do you see that impact, especially with recent moves by Israel to normalize or create degrees of normalization with especially Gulf states, but other North African states, et cetera, as really this sort of ring fence strategy, clearly against Iran, which they can find obviously a chunk of states that would gladly, anyway, my enemy is my friend.
Right.
How do you see this as it's not even intractable, but it becomes something that becomes
irrelevant.
Like a sideshow. I hate saying that for millions of people.
I think that's definitely a trend that's been going on in the last 20 years, is that the Palestinian conflict has become less and less important to the other states in the Middle East. The only state that seems to care about it other than Israel is Iran. The other states in the Middle East, their actual governments have given up on it. There's a joke that used to be said about Sultan Abdulaziz, the founding sultan of Saudi Arabia, and he used to say, the joke is that he would order his servant would bring to him his morning coffee, and the servant would say something like, "It's a very nice day outside today, isn't it, Sultan?" And Sultan would say, "Yes, but the Palestinians are still under the Israeli repression." It would just out of nowhere, he would just bring up this subject, right? And
It's like
now
a
the Saudis
corporate
are
response almost. You know?
right, and now the Saudis are seriously discussing having a functional peace treaty with Israel without a resolution of the Palestinian issue because of where Iran is. So,
Richard,
yeah.
I read recently that Saudis removed anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic parts of their school books or something like on this nature. Do you know whether Palestinians done this?
Whether Palestine has, well, first of all, Palestine doesn't have a unified educational ministry. The West Bank operates according to Fatah, and as far as I know, they haven't removed anything, but they've been pressured to.
Gaza's Hamas.
In Gaza, you have Hamas running some schools, and you have UNRWA running other schools. UNRWA schools have been constantly criticized and flagged for this. Again, I don't know if they've changed, but they're under a lot of pressure to do so. The Hamas schools are under no pressure and under no interest of changing those things.
Okay, thank you.
Now, how much do you see a future set of strategic partitions, or almost like virtual ones, between Egypt and Jordan and Israel, right? Where you basically can outsource these problems long term as you have a de jure environment, and the rest of these states just want to roll. I mean, just economically and trade. And,
well, the thing is, you don't have to outsource anything. The West Bank is under military occupation. From the Jordanian perspective, they don't have to touch anything in the West Bank. Now,
well, no, I'm not saying they have to do this, but I'm saying as an economic incentive, let's say, the Egyptians and the Jordanians, like basically Israel attempting to wash their hands the next 10, 20, 30 years by, by cutting much richer security, trade, and, let's say economic integration deals with Egypt and Jordan. And then as part of that, it's, I have this problem. Can you
just ignore it?
Well, no, not even ignore it. Here's a managed service contract, basically. Can you just run it? I mean, at a certain level, right? It's like because.
No, are you saying? Are you talking about the three-state plan of Egypt annex Gaza, Jordan annexes the West Bank, and Israel?
And Israel cuts a deal with all of them. Some 50-year trade deal when everyone high fives each other, and
Yeah, no. The three-state solution has been proposed. It was popular in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yep.
But basically, Jordan has washed its hands of the West Bank. Like, the last thing the Jordanian monarchy needs is a repeat of Black September.
That's right.
So, and they know that if they take on that kind of Palestinian population, that's exactly what would happen. And Egypt sees Gaza as a flaming garbage heap. So, so they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So no, I think it would be DOA.
Yeah.
Anybody else, or are we closing for tonight?
Fantastic presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Richard,
Thank you, everybody.
Yes,
By the way,
Richard, it was great. Thank you.
Richard, one question. I think you may have said this, and I may have missed it. What is it that defines the Palestinians? Are they distinct from other Middle Eastern Arabs?
Well, there's certainly Levantine Arabs, right? There's a distinction between Levantine Arabs, Arabians, Egyptians, Mesopotamian Arabs. There are definitely cultural distinctions there, and even, like, for example, in Egyptian ledgers, we have the term Shawan, which comes from which is the plural of Shami, meaning Levantine. So they didn't distinguish between Levantines. So somebody from Damascus, somebody from Jerusalem, somebody from Beirut, they would all write Shami or Shawam if it's plural. So there's clearly some distinction that's going on there. But the distinction of a Palestinian versus a Jordanian, or a Palestinian versus a Lebanese, or a Palestinian versus a Syrian, that's a lot harder to hash out. And a lot of those names and experiences are directly related to the colonization and post-colonial environment. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Palestinian identity is a creation of the interaction between the Jews, the British, and the Falah, right? Because these are the Falah. Because the Bedouins don't identify as Palestinian, the Druze don't identify as Palestinian, and the Circassians don't identify as Palestinian. Only the Falah, these peasant settled Arabs identify as Palestinian. And it's a result of the relationship that they've had with the British government and with the Israeli government that follows it, and also with the Arab governments that have routinely oppressed them in the UNRWA system, right? So they're stuck between the Arabs that don't care about them and the Jews who are actually a problem for them. So that's created their own identity, which is why I called it the rise of Palestinianism. This idea that there is a Palestinian identity that is somehow different from the Jordanian Arab identity, for example.
Now the linguistic side, I've read that there's basically an urban Palestinian Levantine Arabic dialect that's different than the rural. So basically very similar to like you have in cities like Paris and rural people. And when it comes
Absolutely,
to
I would say that's correct. I'd also say that Palestinian Arabic is increasingly becoming multi-dialectical.
Exactly.
Because Palestinians who live in Israel or in the West Bank are seeing more Hebrew words leach into their Palestinian Arabic, whereas Palestinians who are living in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, they're not having that, but are having local words from those areas leach into their Arab.
It's like a Spanglish type model around, you know, those.
Yeah, I would say the differences though are more like British versus American English, where it's like there's probably 500 words that we say differently than them.
Well, we say all those all the time.
Exactly.
That's 90%.
Somehow establishmentarianism doesn't change, but flat and apartment do.
Yeah, that's 90% of our language corpus, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say that I'll be looking forward to seeing this on the YouTube channel. It's quite complicated.
I have a feeling that people on YouTube will not wait 3 hours and 20 minutes to hear all of what I've said. They'll probably look at the time print and be like, yeah, that's not happening. But yeah, well, we'll see.
Well, you know, I've looked at some statistics and I'll throw it around on YouTube channel. I get that all the time. And by the way, I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have a website where we organize all of our social media and including YouTube. It's called omnicarta.org. It's instead of Magna Carta, it's called Omnicarta. So please log in. The schedules are there, the YouTube channels are there, and all the social networking websites are there relating to the History channel, and we could actually interact and have more ideas thrown out in those social medias like Facebook, Instagram, and stuff like that. And I'm thinking of also creating a small trailers from, as Rich said, you know, this presentation are very rich and long. We want to create a little bit of trailers to give people, certain areas they can look at and maybe timestamp them, so that if they wanted to hear a certain area of the presentation instead of looking at the whole thing, they can go into and listen to 40 minutes of it or listen to the whole 3 hours. And I personally enjoy listening to 3 hours of it, and definitely love it. And discussions are incredible. And thank you, Richard. This was really good. Like I said, this Wednesday we're going to continue on, I don't know if you want to call it a Jewish subject, but we have ancient text called Josephus Flavius, The Jewish Wars. I'm going to be presenting that. So if you could get, the book on Jewish Wars by Josephus Flavius, and maybe read at least, a couple of chapters or just a summary, we can go over it. It's an interesting aspect of him going through, Hasmonean, royalty of Judaism, to destruction of the temple, and then him living in Rome and the perspective of them looking at Jews from the Roman and Greek eyes, which we know was not very simple, a very complicated history. So we'll be examining the text, but as I said, this is a historical type of meetup. So even though it's going to be ancient text, and we're not particularly interested, or at least I'm not particularly interested in, in, so to speak, his style of writing. I'm more interested in understanding the history of the whole book, so to speak. And
one quick question about the presentation that Rich, is that okay, Zach, if I ask another question or no?
Go ahead, go ahead.
So one thing you didn't mention, which I think is always pretty interesting, is that while you've had very intense ultra Sunni terrorism for decades, whether out of Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Afghanistan, there's been a very concerted effort in the Palestinian occupied territories to prevent any of those groups from ever entering. And when they have, they've had, you could almost wish you could outsource to the Palestinians the Al-Qaeda problem, right? I mean, they've been so effective at just dismantling. And I don't know if that's something you can talk about, because there's something that has always been this weird dynamic, right, where you have this sort of parallel world where you have just ISIS, and prior to that Al-Qaeda and so on for decades, and you don't have one blip a few hundred miles over to the west, and of course there's this sort of semi-functioning existence, but they're able to have so much effectiveness that you just don't see those groups ever forming and sustaining anything remotely, and just the impact of Iran and so on. Obviously Iran has been fairly anti Sunni terrorist in the last 30 years or so. But I don't know if there's any color there you want to go into there. That
the reason, at least in my view, that we call them international jihadists. These are organizations that want to promote a revolution through Islamic holy war to create an Islamic caliphate, and they don't care about the country it's operating in, as opposed to a national jihadist organization like the Taliban, which really the Taliban wants to stay in Afghanistan and doesn't want to go anywhere else. Internationalist organizations haven't been successful in the Palestinian context, international jihadist organizations, because of the levels of control that the current national organizations have. Now, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is not Islamist in orientation, it's Arab socialist in orientation. So it's secular, relatively speaking. Hamas is Islamist in orientation, but it's national Islamist. In both cases, they send their own people in the streets as policemen, and they arrest people, and they search homes. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas are both de facto police states. The PLO coordinates now with Israel, right? Because the PLO controls individual Bantustans, if you want to call it that. And they go through Israeli-controlled, militarily controlled territory to get between them. They also coordinate with the Israelis in terms of arresting people. And of course, they never arrest their own people. They always arrest terrorists from every other group to prevent them from having political power. So it's in their interest from a political perspective to prevent the seeds of international jihadist organizations from forming.
Yep.
Whereas it's not as much in the interest of a number of other regimes, because the police structure is separate from the governing leaders, and the police structure does what they do because they get paid, not because they have a stake in the leadership.
Yeah, no, that's great. And there was a famous Italian journalist that was murdered, Vittore Arrigoni, I think his name was, about 10 years ago. And he was killed by an ISIL or a Daesh subsidiary in Gaza. And I remember reading about just that just launched this massive crackdown on any fighters that went abroad. I mean, just the usual suspects, and just they basically cleaned out a lot of those movements.
Yeah,
that very fascinating.
Hamas has sort of two issues that Fatah doesn't really have. The first one is that Hamas is the only defense there is against losing their government. So they go against any Islamist or jihadist organization that could threaten that power. Islamic State certainly qualifies. The second one is that they have treaty obligations to Israel. Sorry, not treaty, armistice obligations to Israel, right? They have ceasefires. So what actually happens a lot of the time is you'll have a jihadist group like Islamic Jihad or Al-Aqsa Martyrs, and they'll launch a rocket from Gaza into Israel. And rather than celebrating this, Hamas will actually go after those particular units and take them down and do the kinds of collective punishment that Israel would be slapped around for having done, to make sure that doesn't happen again, because they know Israel will turn one rocket into the next invasion.
Yeah.
So Hamas really keeps a tight ship. Now, of course, that means that life is absolutely horrible for the people living there, but it means that these international jihadist organizations can't form roots.
Interesting that you can make a general case that internationalist globalist organizations the world over are no longer as successful as they used to be.
Yeah.
And one of it's something to do with our society in terms of maybe it's the internet or something. But even when you look at in China, where I spend a lot of time for city, if you look closely, I mean, that society is becoming much more fragmented. It's a global trend.
Yeah, but I think what Aaron's pointing to is that there's a distinction where international jihadist organizations are springing up all over the world, right? You have Islamic State attacks in the United States, you have them in the UK, you have them in France, you have them in Tunisia, you have them in Morocco, you have them in Yemen, you have these things all over the world. But in Palestine, the one place where you would expect, because you have a large number of terrorists and disaffected youth and the recipe ingredients, right, to create a good base for international jihadist organization, you're not seeing that in Palestine. Exactly. So why is that? And the point that I was making is that there's a loyalty between the enforcers, the police, right, and the government, because they are the same entity, and the loss of power by the government will be a direct effect on the police. And so they take it very seriously, and the government gives them free rein to do so in a way that would be a police state anywhere else.
I mean, it does speak to this strange dichotomy that Israel and the Palestinians have, right? Like they're right dead center in sort of everything everyone says is this, it's the powder keg, it's all this other stuff going on.
No, they're shrimp and potatoes.
Exactly. No, but that's the whole point. Is that it's that but overall there's a magnitude effect, whether it's with media, whether it's with history, that says that basically this is a far more central issue than it really is relative to everything going across the whole Maghreb or the whole region, and it's people are able to use it as a what's that word or that phrase, like it's like a rallying cry. It's like a rallying. There's a better English word for that, or a phrase for that, which I'm sure James knows. But he had a proper education. There's just this much more. It's almost like a device that I find over time that groups can use, that the conflict itself, whatever side somebody's on, as a representation of their position. But when you start looking at it relative to sort of the real risk board chess pieces moving around, this conflict or this dilemma is really just very, very secondary and tertiary relative to.
I was going to say, when we do Arab Spring, we'll see just how calamitous the rest of this region is.
Yeah. Well, but that's the whole point, is that the Arab Spring happened and nothing happened in the Palestinian territories. Well,
there was nothing to spring.
Well, you could argue there's springable green shoots that are there. They're human beings. Agency.
That was against their own government, usually. They spring.
Right. No. But the difference
of self-rule.
Right. Sure. No, but the thing is that there has to be like a delta between, like, if the government is completely authoritarian, you can't have a peaceful revolt against it
Right.
because it'll just crush it. And if the government is completely democratic, what are you going to revolt about? You just have a protest. So there's like this delta area
Mhm.
where it's not authoritarian enough that they'll just shoot everybody,
Yep.
and it's not democratic enough that you'll just have a protest. And the Palestinian situation is not there. It's in the authoritarian side.
Yeah.
Or if they're in Israel, it's on the democratic side. So like there's nothing to Arab Spring. That was sort of my point.
Yeah. Well, that's a fair point, actually. I mean, but there is this dilemma, and you actually bring up a very interesting point here, which is we maybe don't credit. I don't mean like a good credit, but just kind of
How effective those Hamas
like how incredibly sustainably authoritarian the Palestinian apparatus actually is, even inside the chaos that everything looks like it is, and many times it is, for especially the people, of who the vast majority, probably 80+%, are just like any regular people anywhere, just want to have good schools for their kids and decent everything else. That there's this highly effective authoritarian regime basically on top of them, that you don't get Al-Qaeda, you don't get Arab Spring, like it's like a black hole, it's like a neutron star, it's collapsed, like light goes in, nothing comes out, and we don't sort of see it that way, right? We sort of see it as like, oh, they're right on the edge, you push one little ounce of pressure and pound of pressure, and poof, it all falls over. Clearly there's something very resilient in the authoritarian
yeah, definitely. No,
have.
one of the things we were talking about the Histadrut and this sort of unified socialist schema of running a country.
Yeah.
Hamas is actually very similar to that construction in that they have their militant wing, and they have their healthcare wing, and they have their education wing, and they have their police enforcement wing, and they have their governing wing, and they have literally every aspect, their construction wing. They have all these things. Like, you could be employed by Hamas and have never fired a gun in your life. You're just a teacher.
The odds are you'll never fire a gun in your life, actually. Probably 99 out of 100 probably don't even have a gun. They don't even want them to have a gun. I mean, it's just like, it'll just be that special subset. But what's interesting is we never see inside that, right? We see this sort of, there's kids running around throwing rocks, and NBC people at the fence, this sort of theater. I mean, not theater, like this is human life.
Yeah, no.
This sort of repeatable sort of performance of like, that's what it is. And in reality, behind the scenes, that's probably someone in the PR department of Hamas that basically has, like flip the switch and send out the WhatsApp message to the, who's on schedule today on shift 3. And it's like, away we go, and we don't really see it that way, right? We don't see them
I have
as
a question, by the way, and it's about, I'm sorry if I interrupted, but
no,
I'm
that's fine.
really curious what you think. Like the Israeli politics really shifted to the right in the past, like maybe 20 years. Maybe it is because of the influx of Russians.
That would be my first.
But the thing is that with now getting more and more settlements, I just wonder, where does that lead? Because they can't where those people are going to live. I mean, they're going to put them completely in like cages.
No, I know.
Where does it lead? What do you think?
No. The thing is that the settlements are functionally a non-issue in the resolution, and I'll tell you why. Either the case is that Palestine needs to be devoid of Jews, right? The settlements need to be cleared out, and then you have about 500,000 people. If you include East Jerusalem. If you don't include East Jerusalem, it's about 200,000 people. And those people need to be resettled in Israel. Israel has Soleh Bonim. They have all these construction entities. They can house them. Taking in 200,000 people is not difficult for Israel.
Inside the Israel or just in the West Bank?
No. Inside, like I'm talking about relocating the people from the settlements If you count East Jerusalem, it's about 500,000 people. If you don't count East Jerusalem, it's only 200,000.
No, I was talking about
Wait, wait,
Israeli
wait.
settlements.
Yeah, Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Israeli settlements in the West Bank are divided in two groups: those that are part of East Jerusalem
Mhm.
and those that are not part of East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is about 300,000 people. Not East Jerusalem is about 200,000 people.
Okay.
So if you pull everybody out of the West Bank, that's 200,000 or 500,000, depending on how if you're gonna force Jerusalem to be split. Israel can take in 500,000 people. Israel has a population of 8 million people. They have the space for it. And they have the construction firms to put it together. Will it be costly?
Is
Yeah.
that what they're
but
gonna do? Is that what they
No,
don't
no,
want to do
I'm-
this? They want to have more settlements, right?
I'm saying that you can do that. Or if you make the case that right now the population of the West Bank is 2 million people plus 500,000 settlers, you'll have an 80% Palestinian, 20% Jewish state in the West Bank, in contrast to Israel, which is an 80% Jewish, 20% Arab state. Like it'll just be the flip miracle. It'll just be the flip side, and they stay in the West Bank. So the settlements are or they aren't, and
Yeah,
it
but what's
doesn't
the risk?
actually change the peace mechanics.
Yeah, but what's the risk that over time, we're talking 5 to 15 years, that in whatever successive governments, political, et cetera, that